Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please secretly use the like button's toothbrush to clean a dog's teeth, and then just put the brush back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1956, the SS Andrea Doria, which was a beautiful ocean liner, was considered to be Italy's largest, fastest, and safest ship. But those things would not be what this ship was remembered for. On July 25th of that year, the ship was sailing towards the east coast of the United States when it ran into some very heavy fog. And so, following procedure, the captain slowed the vessel down and turned on their fog whistle. A little while later, another vessel, the Swedish ocean liner called the SS Stockholm, entered the fog as well, but they were unaware of Andrea Doria's position. Now, both vessels were using radar, but unfortunately, both vessels misinterpreted what they were seeing, and so neither of them communicated with the other as they careened towards each other. When visual contact was finally made between the two ships, it was too late. A collision was imminent. At 11:10 p.m. that night, the bow of the Stockholm plowed directly into the side of the Andrea Doria, penetrating over 40 feet inside the ship before coming back out again. The impact killed 46 people on the Andrea Doria and 5 people on the Stockholm. When the story broke, every major news outlet around the world picked it up, including ABC News in the United States. And the news correspondent that they chose to cover this story was a man named Edward Morgan. And unbeknownst to his co-workers, his 14-year-old daughter, Linda Morgan, was on board the Andrea Doria, and just before he went on, he was informed that she was amongst the missing and presumed dead, and there was virtually nothing he could do but wait for more information. And so despite his incredible burden, Edward still went on the air and reported the story without ever losing his composure and without ever mentioning his daughter. But after he got off the air, another story began to develop about the crash. Apparently, a girl who was asleep in one of the rooms on the Andrea Doria that experienced a direct hit from the Stockholm woke up after the crash and didn't know where she was, and she began yelling out for her mother. Meanwhile, a man on board the Stockholm heard the girl's cries, and he ran towards the front of the Stockholm, which is where he heard these cries coming from, and when he got up there, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Perched on the destroyed bow of the Stockholm was a bed, and on that bed was a relatively unhurt 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan. It would turn out when the Stockholm penetrated into the Andrea Doria, the bow of the Stockholm scooped the bed Linda Morgan was on up and kind of dragged her into the ship, and then when it retracted out of the Andrea Doria, it brought that bed and Linda Morgan with it. When Edward Morgan found out that his daughter was the so-called miracle girl, he was overcome with emotions, and he would go back on the air, and this time he would talk about his daughter and her incredible survival story, and he would also talk about how hard it was to deliver the news when it was about someone he loved. Linda would make a full physical recovery. She only suffered from a broken arm, but she would suffer enormously from survivor's guilt as her stepfather and her half-sister were both killed in the crash. On April 27, 1997, a farmer in Indonesia was walking his livestock through a thick sugarcane field near his house when he tripped on something. After he regained his balance and looked down, he noticed a strange mound of dirt that seemed totally out of place. He wanted to dig it up just out of curiosity, but he wasn't on his property, so instead he walked back to the village and he told the village leader about this strange pile of dirt and suggested he see what's under it. So the village leader and some other men headed back out to the field. They find this dirt pile, and the first thing they do is they poke it with a stick. The stick went right into the pile. It was a soft pile of dirt, and when they pulled it out, this horrible stench filled the air that was coming out of this mound. Worried about what they might find underneath this pile, the men decide to leave it alone and go back to the village and tell authorities about it, and the authorities promptly tell them to go back out there and uncover this thing and tell them what they find. And so the village leader and some more men head back out to the field, field, and they start digging. And pretty quickly, their shovel strikes something that's fairly soft inside of this mound. And so after delicately removing some more dirt, they discover a woman's face is looking right back at them. It appeared she had been buried up to her neck, and then someone had just thrown dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities did come out, and they were able to identify the body as belonging to a 21-year-old local woman named Dewey. After asking around the village about this girl, the police determined the last time anyone had seen her was 3 days earlier when she had left her house to run an errand. But after that, no one knew what happened to her. Just a few hours after Dewey's discovery, a 15-year-old rickshaw driver came to the police with additional information. He said 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, so the same day that people had seen Dewey last, he said she had come to him to ask for a ride. And when she got into the rickshaw, he asked where she wanted to go, and she said she did not want to tell him specifically where she was going. Instead, she just wanted him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more information about how to get where she wanted to go as they got closer. And so this really intrigued the driver. And so after he began going in this direction, he turned to her again and said, can you tell me anything more about where we're going? This is really weird that you're not giving me any more information. And so finally, Dewey relented, and she told him she was going to see the shaman. A shaman, in simple terms, is someone who uses magic to cure the sick. The driver did think it was odd that this girl was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and she was being so secretive about it, but after he dropped her off, he hadn't given it much thought until he found out she had died. The police approached the shaman, who was 45-year-old Ahmad Siraji, and they asked him if he had been with Dewey on the night of April 24th. Initially, Siraji said no, he had not been with her, and he had no idea what happened to her. But after police searched his house and found Dewey's belongings inside, Siraji said, okay, I've been lying and I have a confession to make. And he would very nonchalantly tell police that not only had he killed Dewey, he had also killed dozens of other women the same way and buried them in the sugarcane field. And so the police went out to the field and started looking around, and they found all these mounds of dirt all over the place, and under them were women buried up to their neck. After the excavation was all done, the police believed they found the bodies of 42 different women, but truthfully, that was just a guess. They believed there could be more. During his trial, Siraji explained in detail why he did the things he did. He said back in 1986, so 11 years earlier, he had this vivid dream where his deceased father came to him and instructed him to drink the saliva of 70 women. And if he did that, he would become immortal. When Siraji woke up, he didn't chalk up this experience as just a strange dream. He believed he had just had a real interaction with the spirit of his dead father, and so he decided he would do as he was told. But his father didn't explain to him how he was going to extract the saliva from these 70 women. And so after thinking about it for a couple of days, Siraji decided the most efficient way to do it would be to just kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began telling people in his village that he had supernatural powers, that he was able to grant women specifically everlasting beauty and riches. And many people believed it. And so as this rumor spread not only around his village, but to surrounding areas, lots of women heard about it and came to him and requested his services. He would tell them to come back later that night when it was totally dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. Once they arrived, they would come inside of Siraji's house and they would pay him a fee that was roughly equivalent to $300. And then he would tell them he needed to perform a ritual to give them their beauty and their riches. And so they would leave his house, they would cut through a cemetery, and they would enter into that sugarcane field, and they would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them. And he would hand the woman a shovel, and he would tell her to dig a hole in the ground. And he would assure her this is part of the ritual. And so he would stand there as she dug the hole until it was about waist deep. And then he would tell her to get in the hole and put her hands by her side. If she was at all nervous, he would just reassure her again that this is all part of the ritual, that lots of people have done this before, that it's totally safe. And so she'd get in the hole, she'd put her hands by her side, Siraji would take the shovel and he would fill the hole back in until she was completely immobilized. And then at this point, Siraji would pull out a cable, he would wrap it around their neck, and he would strangle them to death. And then once they were dead, he would pull their body out of the hole, and then he would forcibly extract their saliva. And then after that, he would take the shovel again and dig the hole a little bit deeper, and then he would put the body back inside the hole, making sure their head was still sticking out of the ground. And he would orient them so their face was looking towards his house. house because he believed having these women constantly looking at him at all hours of the day gave him more power. He said as for Dewey, when she first came to his house and she had paid that fee, she was worried about leaving and going and doing this ritual. It scared her. And so Siraji told her to wait, and he went into the other room where his wife was, and he told her that, hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to calm her down. And his wife, who had no idea her husband was a mass murderer, just immediately went along with it. She came back into the room and she assured Dewey that everything was totally fine. They had done this before. It was all going to be perfectly safe. And she even said she would come with them to do this ritual. And so at this, Dewey was much more calm and she agreed to go. And so the trio left the house. They went through the cemetery, out to the field, and then only 2 people came back. Siraji was executed in 2008 by firing squad, and his wife was sentenced to life in prison. Around midnight on September 3rd, 1986, Doug Wells and his wife Kristen were pulling onto their street in western Montana when they noticed a camper parked in front of their house. Neither of them recognized the camper, and so when they pulled into their driveway, Doug got out and walked over and looked inside to see if anyone was in there. And there was a man sleeping in the front seat. Doug didn't wake him up. Instead, he went back to his wife. They talked about it, and they decided that this man must have just randomly parked in front of their house, and that most likely the next day he would leave. And so the couple went inside their house and they began getting ready for bed. At some point, Doug rounded up all the trash inside of the house and was going to bring it outside to put into the trash bin. And when he went outside, standing in his front lawn is the same guy who was just sleeping inside of the camper. And so Doug very cautiously goes down the front steps and he yells out to this guy and says, what are you doing here? And immediately the man put his hands up and said he meant no harm. He said his name was Wayne Nance, and he actually worked with Doug's wife, Kristen, at the furniture store in town. Wayne went on to say that he happened to be driving down their street earlier that day, and he spotted someone standing outside one of their windows looking in their house, and he knew it was Kristen's house, and he looked in their driveway, and he saw that Kristen wasn't home, and it looked like nobody was home, and so he decided he would just park out front and try to scare off this person and wait for Kristen to get back. But by the time Kristen got back, he had fallen asleep. Doug was totally caught off guard by this whole situation. The idea that there's this guy on his property talking about another guy that was lurking around his property. And so he asked Wayne, did you see this guy again after that first time you saw him? And Wayne said no, he hadn't, but he didn't have a flashlight. And so maybe if Doug went in the house and got some flashlights, the 2 of them could walk the property and make sure nobody was there. Doug thanked him for the offer and said, okay, well, why don't you come in the house and I'll go look for those flashlights. And so Doug led the way inside of his house, and as soon as Wayne got in the house and shut the front door behind him, he pulled out a metal pipe he was hiding and smashed Doug over the back of the head. Doug turned around and Wayne hit him again over the face, and before long the 2 of them were struggling on the ground. Kristen, who was upstairs, heard the commotion, and she came running down the stairs, and she sees at the bottom her husband, who's bleeding profusely from his head. He's covering himself up on the ground, while Wayne, her co-worker, is standing over him, punching and kicking him. Before Kristen could do anything, Wayne noticed her up on the stairs, and he drew a pistol and aimed it at her and told her to come down here and tie up your husband's arms and legs. Kristen, who's in shock, is just hoping this was just a robbery and that they would have their lives spared. And so she does as she's told. She walks down. Wayne throws her some cord. She ties up her husband's arms and legs. And then afterwards, Wayne leads Kristen back upstairs to the bedroom where he ties her up as well. After that, Wayne went back down to the main floor where Doug was still laying on the ground, and he grabbed Doug by the legs and he pulled him down the flight of stairs to the basement where he tied him up to a pole. And then he savagely beat him with the pipe before Wayne pulled out an 8-inch blade and plunged it directly into Doug's chest all the way in. And then when he pulled it out again, Doug slumped over. Wayne went back upstairs all the way to the second floor to check on Kristen, and he saw she had managed to get partially out of her restraints and she was reaching for the landline, and so he jumped on top of her and managed to restrain her all over again. And then after he was confident in her restraints, he went back downstairs to make sure Doug was dead. When he got down there, he saw Doug was still slouched over in the same position he had left him, and so Wayne assumed Doug must be dead, and Wayne went back upstairs to assault Kristen. But Wayne was wrong. Doug wasn't dead. And after Wayne went upstairs that second time, Doug, despite his horrific head and chest injuries, managed to wriggle out of his restraints and then hobbled over to a workbench where he had a rifle laying out because Doug was actually a gunsmith. And so he took the rifle and he loaded it with the 1 round he found on the table. And then he walked over to the base of the stairs, he raised his rifle, and he made his way up to the main floor. He didn't come in contact with Wayne, and he looked around the first floor, he didn't see him, and he heard his wife screaming upstairs. And so he made his way way to the next set of stairs and began walking up with his rifle raised. At the top of the stairs to the second floor, there was a hallway that ran right and left out of sight. And so as Doug is making his way up, he can hear off to the left, out of view, his wife screaming in the bedroom, and he can hear the sound of very heavy footsteps running down the hall towards the landing where he is. And so Doug positioned himself in the stairwell, he took aim about chest height with his rifle, and he waited for their attacker to show himself. And so as soon as Wayne came flying around the corner with his knife in his hand, Doug just fired one shot that struck him right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards, totally shocked at what had just happened. He began to stagger, and Doug, meanwhile, turned his rifle around like a baseball bat because he didn't have any more rounds, and he just starts walking down the hall, smashing Wayne as Wayne continues to stumble and fall and try to run away from Doug. And finally, he gets away from Doug, charges into the bedroom where Kristen is, and he grabs his pistol, and he turns around and he fires 3 shots towards the door where Doug is now standing. And Doug, he's unfazed. One round hits him in the leg, the other 2 miss. He doesn't care. He just walks up to Wayne and begins bashing his head in with the back of this rifle. He hits him so many times that the buttstock of the rifle explodes and the metal of the rifle bends like an L. And at some point, Wayne drops the gun because he's getting viciously beaten on by Doug and his rifle. And Doug sees that, he grabs the pistol, and he fires the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics would show up shortly thereafter, and Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would make full recoveries. As for Wayne, he would die the following day from his injuries. After the incident, the police investigated Wayne Nance to see who this guy was, and they discovered that almost certainly he had been a serial killer that was connected to at least 6 cold case murders from 1974 to 1986. But because Wayne never confessed to any of these murders before he died, the true number of people he killed is still unknown. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. If you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please secretly use the like button's toothbrush to clean a dog's teeth and then just put the brush back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. One night in August of 1986, villagers in a tiny rural town in West Africa heard a loud booming sound coming from outside. Most of the villagers thought this sound was thunder, others had no idea what it was, but the noise seemed insignificant. Little did they know, that sound was actually a death sentence. They just didn't know it yet. This story sounds like it was pulled straight out of an apocalypse movie, except it really happened. And the scary part is, it could happen again today. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a s'more, but instead of chocolate, use mud. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Before sunrise on August 22nd, 1986, a man named Ephraim Che woke up feeling groggy and confused. As he lay in his bed inside of his small mud brick house perched up on a cliff, he tried to remember what happened the night before. He didn't know why, but he knew, something happened last night. I gotta remember it. But as he lay there kind of jogging his memory, he felt like there were holes in his memory, like he couldn't quite piece together what had happened the day or night before. However, there was one thing he distinctly remembered about the night before, and that was at some point he had heard one really loud boom of thunder outside. And Ephraim, kind of somewhere in the back of his mind, had thought, oh, it's going to rain tonight, and maybe when I wake up it'll still be raining. And then Ephraim, no matter how hard he focused, he couldn't really remember how much time passed after hearing that booming sound and then getting in his bed the night before. But at some point he remembered being in his bed and feeling kind of sick. And that was it. That was his whole memory of the night before. And so that morning, August 22nd, when Ephraim has suddenly woken up feeling confused, he rolled over and he looked out the window right nearby his bed, and he looked outside and he saw the sky was clear and the grass was totally dry. There was no indication that it had rained anytime recently. And so Ephraim is thinking to himself, something is definitely off here, but I just can't get my mind right. And so finally, Ephraim just sits up in his bed, he swings his legs out of his bed onto the ground, he stands up and practically falls over once he's on his feet. But he eventually gets himself back up, kind of steadies himself, and then he thinks, okay, I need to go check on my 4 kids and make sure they're okay. But the second Ephraim began to move in his house, it was like his body didn't obey his mind. Because moments later, instead of checking on his kids, Ephraim had wandered out his front door and was just standing out in front of his house, just kind of staring off into the distance, having no idea why he walked out there. The village where Ephraim lived was called Nios, and Nios is extremely rural. There's no electricity, there's no running water, and there's no paved roads for miles. The village is actually split into 2 parts. There's Upper Nios and Lower Nios. Ephraim lived in Upper Nios, right near this big, beautiful lake called Lake Nios, but the majority of villagers lived in Lower Nios, which was below the lake. So that morning, after Ephraim kind of found himself standing outside of his hut for no reason, he began looking around in hopes that other people would be out and about in Upper Nios, where he lived, so he could go talk to them and try to figure out what was wrong with him or, what was going on generally. But as he scanned around Upper Nios, he saw there was not another soul anywhere. He was it. He was the only person walking around. So, without giving it much thought, Ephraim decided he would just start walking down towards Lower Nios to try to talk to someone down there. And so he left his hut and he began walking down the hill that would take him to Lower Nios. After Ephraim got about halfway down this hill, right when he was near Lake Nios, he stopped because suddenly he became totally aware of the fact that the world was totally silent. Normally, the baboons in the nearby forest would be barking and insects would be humming and birds would be chirping, but now it was just completely, totally silent. Even the mosquitoes that were a totally annoying constant in Ephraim's life were gone. It was like the entire world had just shut down. And as Ephraim is looking around, wondering what is going on here, he hears off to his right, over near the lake, a woman shrieking at the top of her lungs. And so Ephraim whipped his head in the direction the screams were coming from, and he saw there was this woman about 100 feet away. She was a local, and she was looking right at Ephraim, and she was barely dressed, and she was ripping the rest of her clothes off, and she was just screaming. And so acting on instinct, Ephraim immediately turned and just started running towards this woman. And as he's bounding towards her, getting closer and closer, he's starting to notice there's these strange shapes on the ground kind of near this woman. But as he was staring at them, he just couldn't quite place what they were. But when he got about 20 feet away from this shrieking woman, he stopped again because he realized the shapes on the ground were this woman's entire family. They were all just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. And near them was all of their cattle, also just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. But as Ephraim stared at each of these people and each of these animals on the ground, he saw there was some blood around their noses and their mouths, and he realized no person who's sleeping would be that still. These people are all dead. These animals are all dead. And so standing there, Ephraim turned his attention from the bodies back to this woman who had dropped to her knees, and she was grabbing her father's arm and yanking on it and screaming for him to please wake up. But Ephraim could tell there was nothing she could do. Everyone was gone. And Ephraim knew somewhere deep down that, he's supposed to go over and help this woman or console her. But suddenly this wave of fear came over him. The combination of having no idea what's going on, his mind really wasn't working still, and now seeing all these dead people, it was like he just couldn't handle it. And so even though he felt terrible about this, Ephraim took one last look at this very distraught woman and her deceased family, and he turned and he ran away. And when he got back to the main trail, he continued downhill in the direction of Lower Nios. Like all of you, I spend virtually all of my time daydreaming about climbing onto the back of a wild stallion and galloping down a deserted highway into an abandoned city full of zombies that I need to fight off using my wide array of strange DIY weaponry. Well, dream no more, because today we can kill zombies for real, digitally, with Doomsday: Last Survivors. And before I show you this gem of a game, I have a surprise for you. Thanks to Doomsday, not only can you now slaughter zombies with me, but also you can win $10,000 in cash prizes. Click the link in the description below and download the game, and you could potentially win some of that money. In Doomsday, which is a zombie survival strategy mobile game, you can choose whatever shelters you want and then go out and recruit the strongest heroes, like Catherine with her amazing spinning chainsaw, and they can lead your squad and defend your base from the endless waves of zombies. Another awesome thing about this game is you can march freely and change your route at any time to attack the enemy strategically. Also, you can join an alliance to explore the world with other zombie hunters. Heck, you might even run into me and Lungy's alliance, and maybe we'll let you join. So again, Doomsday, which lets you finally kill zombies for real, digitally, is offering $10,000 in cash prizes. To potentially win some of that money, click the link in the description below and download the game, and you will see there is a might ranking, and the top 5 in that ranking will each walk away with $1,000 each. Outside of that might ranking, many other players will be chosen for cash prizes, some up to $500 each. Hurry and download Doomsday right now so you can join the limited time events to get the legendary hero Jaden and a $250 gift pack for free. The next zombie wave will arrive in 8 hours, so join me and old Lungy now. The villagers in Lower Nios lived in these tiny huts with tin roofs that were closely grouped together, and usually, even early in the morning, Lower Nios was a very happy and lively place with kids running around and animals walking in the road and music playing. But as Ephraim came down the hill and was within earshot of Lower Nios, it was deadly silent. And so with panic starting to rise inside of Ephraim, he began to run at full speed, hoping that when he turned the corner and looked down the main road of Lower Nios, he would see the people he was hoping he would see. But when he turned the corner and looked down Main Street, all he saw were dead animals everywhere. They completely covered the streets, the sidewalk, everything. And so at this point, Ephraim was so desperate to see another person that he kept his eyes looking straight ahead so as not to look at all the dead animals, and just ran straight into Lower Nios, and he turned towards the first hut he saw, and he ripped the door open and he stepped inside, and as soon as he did, he just stopped. Because on the ground right in front of him was a woman who was very clearly deceased, just laying in the middle of the floor. She had a bowl of corn right near her hand as if she had been eating and then just fell dead. And so Ephraim, he's staring at this dead woman, and then he looks up and he realizes the bedroom is right in eyesight, and he can see her family in their beds. And at first Ephraim thought, oh, they're sleeping. But then as he continued to stare through the doorway into this room, he saw none of them were moving. Their chests were not going up and down from breathing. Her whole family, they were dead too. At this, Ephraim kind of stumbled backwards out of the hut, and then he turned around to face the road he had just been on with all the animals. And when he saw the road again, it was like a piece of his brain started working properly again, because he realized those weren't animal bodies. All those bodies he saw when he came in, those were people. Yes, there were some animals, but most of them were people. He could see people slumped on top of each other, kind of piled up in doorways. He saw one person who was on his motorcycle in the middle of the road, just slumped over his handlebars. And many of the bodies were either naked or partially clothed, with piles of clothing next to them, as if they had been trying to rip their clothes off as fast as they could, like the woman up at the lake had been doing. And as Ephraim looked around in horror, he also realized realized that there were no markings or cuts or wounds on any of these people. It was like they were just going about their lives when suddenly they died. And so without anything else to do, Ephraim just continued to walk in the direction he had come into the village, hoping that if he kept on going, he might run into someone who was alive. And so he begins walking down the road, he's stepping over bodies, he has no idea what to make of this, and then way down the road, up ahead, he sees there are two people coming towards him. There's a man and what looks like his son, and they're jogging down the road, stumbling over bodies, running towards Ephraim. And so Ephraim stops, expecting these people are going to stop and talk to him. But as these two people got closer, Ephraim saw both of them, the father and the son, their eyes were wide and they were looking straight ahead with kind of a distant 1,000-yard stare, and they didn't stop for a second for Ephraim. It was like they didn't even see him. They just kept on running down the road, past all the bodies. Ephraim didn't try to stop them. He just watched as they passed. And then at some point they veered off the road and ran into the forest and disappeared. And it was at this moment that another part of Ephraim's brain seemed to kind of fit into place. Because as he watched this father and son disappear, he suddenly had this memory come flooding back into his mind. And it was a memory of when he was a kid and his grandfather told him a story. And the story was about Nyos villagers a long, long time ago who decided they wanted to cross Lake Nyos from one side to the other. And so their leader magically parted the waters of Lake Nyos, creating a walkway on the lake bed from one side to the other, and the villagers began to walk. And then about halfway across, a mosquito landed on the leader's shoulder, and when he went to slap the mosquito, he lost control of the waters and they came crashing down and drowned all of them. Ephraim's grandfather told Ephraim that the ghosts of these drowned villagers now resided between these two big rocks located near Lower Nyos. And so growing up, Ephraim, along with many other people in this village, believed that because of these ghosts, Lower Nyos must be haunted. And in fact, that was actually why Ephraim built his house in Upper Nyos, to avoid these ghosts. And so now, as this memory of hearing this story from his grandfather has come flooding back to Ephraim, he thinks to himself, of course, all of this is the work of those ghosts. And so fearing he would be attacked next, Ephraim turned and just continued running down the road, dodging bodies as he went. And as he ran along, periodically he would stop at various tin huts and he would fling the door open in hopes he would find some survivors. But each time he went inside, everybody in there would be dead, lying in their beds or sitting in chairs or lying on the ground. But after running for quite a while, Ephraim turned to go into yet another hut, and right as he reached for the door opened on its own. And standing in front of him was the owner of this hut. His name was Joseph Naquain, and he was in much worse shape than Ephraim. The night before, Joseph had been inside of his hut when suddenly outside he heard that very loud booming sound that sounded like thunder to Ephraim. And then after hearing the sound, Joseph heard his daughter in her bed making this terrible snoring sound. And so instinctively, Joseph turned to walk over to his daughter to make sure she was okay, but he only got a few steps before he collapsed to the ground. He had woken up that morning with cuts all over his arms from where he fell, and he was also totally exhausted and very confused like Ephraim, and so he managed to drag himself over to his daughter's bed, and he pulled himself up onto her bed, and when he got up there, he realized his daughter was deceased. And so now, Joseph has opened the door, and he's looking out, and there's all these dead people everywhere, and Ephraim is looking back at him, and Joseph just can't process anything. He's just standing there in a total daze, and Ephraim, he wanted to say something, but no words could come out, and so he too just stood there looking at Joseph. And the two men just stood there right on the threshold of this hut, staring at each other, saying nothing for several minutes, until finally they both just extended their hands and shook silently, and then Ephraim turned around and ran back into the road. And so Joseph at first followed Ephraim kind of out of instinct, but very quickly he veered off from Ephraim, and Joseph went into his neighbor's hut to see if they were okay. But when he opened the door and went inside, he saw all of his neighbors were deceased. But Joseph, he barely reacted to this. It was like he was so numb to what was going on, he just couldn't process it. But after seeing all of his neighbors dead, somewhere deep down inside of his consciousness, Joseph knew he had to go find help. That was his mission. And so he left his neighbor's hut, he ran back to his own hut, he climbed onto his motorcycle, and he started to drive. It took Joseph a long time to drive to the next closest village, but when he got there, there were people and they were all alive. And so Joseph tried to tell them what had happened in his village, but Joseph just had such a hard time putting his thoughts together that his sentences just didn't make sense. He was kind of incoherent. And then when he did make sense, the things he was talking about, an entire village just suddenly dying, sounded crazy. And so nobody at this other village took Joseph seriously, and so that day, nobody from this other village went to Nios to see what was going on. But the next day, people from this other village did go to Nios, and when they got there, it was exactly as Joseph had said. The whole village was dead. And as authorities would soon find out, it was not just Nios that was affected by this tragic event. Several villages not far from Nios had also suffered mass casualty events on the morning of August 22nd, 1986. And soon, news of these strange mass death events in West Africa were making the news all over the world. And so on August 25th, 3 days after this terrible event, an American scientist named Joseph Devine turned on his TV and saw the news coming out of West Africa. The newscasters were totally baffled about how this could have happened, and no one can figure out what killed these people. And Devine is just staring at his TV in shock, and then he turns, runs to his phone, and he calls his contact at the US government and told them, "You gotta send me to Nios." And because his contact knew Devine's background, he immediately said, "Yes, I'll get you on a flight as soon as we can." Devine and his scientific partner, Haraldur Sigurdsson, arrived in Nios 2 days later on August 27th. When they got there, they saw the military was burying the dead in these huge mass graves, and looking on were the few survivors of this event, like Joseph and Ephraim. Along with Ephraim's family, they also survived, as well as other villagers who had come to see what happened. And so as Devine and Sigurdsson kind of maneuver their way through this crowd of very solemn people, they heard them talking about what they thought happened to all these people. And the theories ranged from secret governmental experiments to invisible superweapons to even atomic explosions. Others, like Ephraim, believed this was paranormal, that those ghosts from the drowned villagers had attacked the village. But Devine and Sigurdsson were reasonably sure that none of those theories were correct. They felt like they did know what actually happened because they had actually witnessed a tragedy like this before, but on a much smaller scale. 2 years earlier, and 60 miles south of Nios, in an area called Lake Manoon, 37 people suddenly dropped dead. And Devine and Sigurdsson had been sent out there to try to figure out what happened to these people. And after lots of experimentation, they came up with a theory that explained what happened. And they called it unknown unnatural hazard. They tried to warn people in the area that this could happen again. And in fact, Sigurdsson had written an entire scientific paper about this theory and submitted it to a prestigious science journal. But nobody took Devine or Sigurdsson seriously. What they were proposing sounded made up. It sounded preposterous. But now, in Nios, it looked very much like their unknown, unnatural hazard had happened again. Devine and Sigurdsson would leave the group of people watching this mass burying take place, and they would make their way up the hill to Lake Nios, where they would immediately get to work taking water samples from deep inside the lake. And after capping these samples, the lids began popping off. And that was the moment that Devine and Sigurdsson knew their unknown, unnatural hazard theory had to be correct. Lake Nios is not your typical lake. It is a crater lake, which means it sits inside of a volcanic crater, which is a big, deep, bowl-like pit that was formed from a past volcanic explosion. And because of this volcanic activity, there is carbon dioxide in Lake Nios. A lot of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, or CO2 for short, is an odorless, invisible gas that we actually breathe out when we exhale. Now, if you inhale a little bit of CO2, that won't hurt you. If you inhale a little bit more, like a medium amount of CO2, you could feel dizzy and nauseous. Your skin will start to feel like it's on fire. You'll have rapid breathing. It'll be horrible, but you'll most likely survive if you stop breathing CO2. And if you breathe in a ton of CO2, you're dead. The CO2 in Lake Nios had been trapped at the bottom of the lake for as long as anyone knew. But on the night of August 21st, 1986, something happened that caused that trapped gas to be released. Now remember, on that night, August 21st, Ephraim recalled hearing what he thought was thunder outside, and also Joseph would recall hearing a loud booming sound that night. Now, we don't know exactly what that sound was, but it's safe to say that that noise, whatever it was connected to releasing the gas. Maybe it was the sound of a rock slide and big rocks plummeted into the lake and hit the lake bottom and freed the gas that way. Or maybe it was just an actual volcanic eruption inside of the lake. Whatever it was, when the CO2 was freed, it bubbled to the top like it bubbled and popped off the lids of their sample tubes. And when it reached the top of the water, it kind of formed a cloud above the lake. Now, we can't see the cloud, but you can imagine a big cloud, and then this toxic CO2 cloud kind of rolled its way down the hill towards Lower Nios and other villages in the area. And when this big toxic cloud began coming in contact with people, with animals and insects, virtually all of them died. As for the few who survived, like Ephraim and his family and Joseph, they were left feeling horribly confused, disoriented, nauseous, totally dizzy from CO2 poisoning. But when they finally were able to get away from Nios and breathe fresh air, the effects of CO2 poisoning wore off and they were okay. This deadly CO2 phenomenon was exactly what happened on a much smaller scale 2 years earlier at Lake Manoon. It was the unknown, unnatural hazard that Devine and Sigurdsson had tried to warn people about. The official death toll of the Lake Nios disaster was more than 1,700 people and more than 3,500 livestock, although exact numbers will likely never be known. Today, people have moved back into Upper and Lower Nios, including Ephraim, despite the fact that authorities have said that lake is still very dangerous and another unknown, unnatural hazard, aka a CO2 disaster, could absolutely happen again. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button a s'more, but instead of using chocolate, use mud. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings we upload remastered versions of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Español. We post near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to take the like button out on your boat for a scuba diving trip, and once they get off the boat and they go underwater, just turn your boat around and head back to shore. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. A 28-year-old Russian man named Artyom Sidorkin started having severe chest pains, and at first he tried to ignore it, but it got so bad he could barely stand up, and then he began coughing up blood, and so finally he went to the emergency room. When he got there, even before the doctors examined him or gave him an x-ray, just based on the way he presented to them, being pale in the face and hunched over and very sick looking, they assumed this must be something very serious. So that day they brought Mr. Sidorkin in for an examination, and after talking to him and hearing about all of his symptoms and just looking at him, the assumption was he probably has a tumor in his lungs. And so they sent him in for an x-ray, and afterwards the radiologist looked at the x-ray and confirmed that yep, there is a mass growing inside of your lungs. And so before they went to just start removing huge pieces of his lung, they told him that they would like to do a biopsy where they remove a small piece of the tissue and test it to see if it's cancerous or not. And so Mr. Sidorkin is terrified, but he says okay. He schedules his surgery. He goes in a couple days later, and the surgeon pulls out a piece of his lung tissue, and as it's sitting on the tray, he looks down at the tissue, the surgeon does, and he realizes there's something hidden inside of the tissue, as if the tissue was like an envelope holding something inside of it. And so he opened it up, and there, growing on the side of his lung, was a small fir tree. It was 5 centimeters long, it was green, it looked very lively, it was just a thriving little tree. The doctors believed Mr. Sidorkin, who was a botanist, had inhaled a seed of a fir tree, and it got lodged inside of his lung tissue. And then as it grew, its pine needles began piercing his blood capillaries, causing him to cough up blood. After the discovery of what was inside of his lung, a spokeswoman for the Royal Botanic Gardens in London said that it is possible for a seed to germinate inside of the dark, damp conditions inside of a lung, but it is unbelievably bizarre. When doctors informed Mr. Sidorkin that he did not have cancer, he had a tree, Mr. Sidorkin was shocked, and he said, I never got the sense that there was a tree growing inside of me. But more than shocked, he was just relieved that he was cancer-free. There is a picture of this tree inside of his lung tissue, but it's a bit graphic, so if you want to see it, go ahead and Google tree in lung, and I'm sure you'll find it. Growing up, Pauline Dakin always suspected that there was just something off about her family. And years later, she would find out she was right. In 1970, when she was 5 years old, her parents, Ruth and Warren, separated. And to Pauline, it wasn't that much of a shock because her father, Warren, was a heavy drinker and he's extremely violent. But after they separated and Pauline, her mother, and brother had moved into another house on the other side of Vancouver, Canada, Pauline noticed her mom started to act really anxious all the time, but she never knew why. When Pauline was 9, her mother told her and her brother that they were going to go on a vacation to Winnipeg, which is 1,000 miles away from Vancouver. And so they loaded up the van, they hopped in, and they drove all the way to Winnipeg. And when they got out, they went inside their new vacation home, and Ruth informed her children that they were actually never going back to Vancouver. And when Pauline and her brother said, why? Dad's still back in Vancouver. I want to see Dad. But Pauline said, sorry kids, this is the way it has to be. And when you're old enough, I'll explain everything. Confused and sad, Pauline and her brother began starting a new life in Winnipeg. Over the next 4 years, Pauline never saw her father, and so she lost touch with him. But she started making a couple close friends in Winnipeg, and she was starting to feel like this was home. But right as she was starting to feel normal, her mother told her and her brother that they needed to move right now all over again. This time they were going to go all the way to New Brunswick, the far east side of Canada. Their mother made them swear they would tell no one about this move. But later that day, when Pauline was with her best friend Wendy, she let it slip that she was moving, and so when Ruth came to pick Pauline up from Wendy's house, the two girls had to affect these sort of breezy goodbyes to each other so that Pauline's mother wouldn't suspect anything. Once in New Brunswick, the family did put down roots, and they stayed there for many years, but Pauline's mother still was just incredibly anxious and paranoid about something. The kids just had no idea what it was. Fast forward to 1988, when Pauline was 23 years old, she had moved 2 hours away from the family home in New Brunswick and was living with her boyfriend and was working as a reporter at a local newspaper. And during that time, her mother called her and said, hey, I'd like to meet you at a motel. I'm finally ready to tell you everything about your childhood. Pauline was really intrigued and excited. This was a conversation that was literally decades in the making. And so Pauline eagerly went to the motel. She saw her mother waiting outside, kind of pacing around, looking very anxious. And so she walks up to her mom and she waves and she's about to speak when her mother just looks up at her and puts her finger over her lips, telling her to be quiet. And then she jams an envelope into Pauline's hands. And on the envelope, it just says, don't say anything. Put your jewelry inside of this envelope. It's probably actually bugged. I will explain everything inside. Just please don't speak. And so now Pauline's really confused, but she did as she was told. She took her jewelry off, put it in the envelope, and gave it back to her mother. And then the two of them silently walked into the motel, into the room where Pauline's mother was staying. When they went inside, there was a man sitting in the middle of the room that Pauline immediately recognized. It was the reverend of their church when they used to live in Vancouver. His name was Stan Sears, and Pauline's mother had been his secretary the whole time they'd gone to that church. Pauline always knew her mother and Stan were close friends, and in fact had kept in touch after they left Vancouver and were in Winnipeg and then New Brunswick. In fact, Pauline remembers periodically seeing Stan show up in Winnipeg and New Brunswick to visit with Pauline's mother. So it was a surprise, but not a total shock, when Pauline's mother confessed to her that in fact she and Stan had fallen in love, and in fact they had had a secret relationship from the time they lived in Vancouver. But this revelation was nothing compared to what Pauline heard next. Her mother explained that the reason they had had to move so many times during her childhood was because Pauline's father, Warren, was actually a mobster and was a key member of an organized crime syndicate in Vancouver. Right after they separated, Pauline's mother found out she had a hit put on her head because the mob now believed that the husband could not control her anymore and she knew too much. Stan also found out that he had a hit on his head because Ruth discovered that the mob wanted to kill him too because they knew about their relationship. And then also, apparently Stan was counseling a man that was in his congregation that wound up being a mobster, and so the mob believed this man had given up critical information to Stan, making him even more of a liability. At first, Stan said he didn't believe any of this, but when he found out the man he had been counseling had been assassinated, he knew it was true. They decided not to tell the police and instead go into hiding together because Pauline's mother knew what happened to families that snitched on the mob. They were made examples of. And so when Pauline and her family moved to Winnipeg and then to New Brunswick, Stan actually moved there as well in tandem, which is why Pauline had seen him periodically showing up at their house to visit with Pauline's mother. Pauline was understandably completely shocked, but at the same time, she was kind of happy to have some sort of explanation for all the strange things that had happened in her childhood. And so over the course of the next several hours, Pauline sat in this motel room with her mother and Stan and asked them every question she could think of. And she discovered that whenever she came home from school and she found her mother furiously pulling all the food out of the fridge and the pantry, throwing it all away with no explanation, that was actually because they found out the mob had tried to poison them. Or these 6 different times Pauline was unenrolled from the school she was at and then moved to a different school across town, that was because there was a credible threat the mob had discovered where Pauline was going to school. And so by the end of the weekend, Pauline not only learned about this totally crazy past she had, but she also learned that she was still in danger. And so before Pauline headed back home, she asked her mother and Stan what she should do to stay safe. And Pauline's mother said, well, that's actually the reason we called you here now, because after all these years, we were just tired of being in hiding, and so we've already spoken to the authorities, and they've moved us into a special witness protection program for families connected to the mob. When you enter this program, it's referred to as entering the weird world, where basically you're not really safe, but you have agents that follow you around that are undercover that track what you're doing and make sure there's no assassination attempt on you. And before Pauline could even ask, her mother told her that as a measure of her and Stan entering the weird world, they asked that a couple of agents monitor Pauline and her brother, even though they didn't know they were being monitored. At this point, Stan reached forward with a radio and he said, here's a radio that actually broadcasts to the agents that are following you pretty much all the time. But you should only use it if you're truly in a desperate situation, because as soon as you call out for help, there are going to be people that are risking their lives to come save you. As Pauline is holding this radio, she looks at her mom and Stan and she says, well, what happened to Dad? Is he in jail? And at this point, Pauline's mother says, no, he's not. He's in the weird world too. And she handed Pauline a letter that was from her father addressed to Pauline, and it basically spelled out that he had been moved into the weird world and he was looking forward to Pauline joining them at some point when she was ready. So now Pauline has this radio and this letter, and she's looking at her mother and Stan, and she's just totally overwhelmed, and her mother just tells her, go home, think about what you want to do next, and if you want to join the witness protection program and join the weird world with us, just let me know and we'll make it happen. And so Pauline, who's in a total state of shock, gives her mom a hug and gives Stan a hug and says, okay, bye, I'll be in touch. And she leaves the motel and she gets in her car and she's about to back up when she looks and sees Stan running outside holding something in his hand. And so Pauline stops, Stan runs up to the window, and he says, "Hey, I forgot to give you this." And he held up this round piece of metal that he told her was a GPS transponder. It was magnetized, and she should put it out of sight underneath her car. And what it does is it constantly gives off her location to the agents that are following her. So if she was in trouble, it would be easier for them to find her. And so Pauline thanked him, put the transponder under her car, and Stan went back into the motel. And so Pauline went back home with the intention of just digesting this information, knowing that she was being watched, she had this radio, she was, relatively safe, and her plan was to just give it a couple of days before she committed to joining the witness protection program and joining the weird world. But after only a couple of days, her paranoia was so high that she dumped her boyfriend, she quit her job, and she moved out of her house into a separate apartment, and she called her mother and said, "I can't take it anymore. I feel totally unsafe. I want to join the weird world." Her mother and Stan were delighted at her decision, but they told her it wasn't a simple process getting into the weird world, that a lot of people were involved in her basically giving up her old life and entering this new one. And so Pauline's mother told her that she would be in touch with one of her agents, and they would contact Pauline when it was time for her to go. And so anxious and scared, Pauline began to wait and wait and wait. And her mother said, "Oh, just give it some time. They'll be in touch soon." But the waiting dragged on for 5 years. And in that time, Pauline met a new boyfriend, Kevin, who became her husband. And in conversations with him, Pauline started to doubt this whole mafia thing was even true. And so she decided, in order to find out if this really was a real thing, that the mafia was actually after them, that Pauline would need to set up a sting operation on her mother and Stan. And so Pauline called her mother and very convincingly told her that, "Oh my goodness, someone just broke into my apartment. I think it was someone from the mafia. I don't know what happened, but can you tell me what to do? Should I call the police? What do I do?" And her mother said, "No, don't call the police. Whatever you do, don't call the police. I'm going to get in touch with Stan and see if he knows what to do." And just a couple of minutes later, Pauline's mother called back and said, "Okay, honey, I spoke to Stan, and he spoke to the undercover agents that sit outside your house and have been watching you for all these years. And they said that, yes, unfortunately, not one, but 2 men from the mafia broke into your house today. But luckily, they went up, they grabbed them, they're in custody, so you're safe now." And Pauline said, "Mom, I made that up. No one's been in my apartment. I've been here the whole day. I lied to you. No one broke in." And it was at this point that Pauline realized her mother and Stan had been living a lie since she was 5 years old. There was no mafia. Her father was not a mobster in some Vancouver crime syndicate. It was all made up. It would turn out Stan was suffering from something called delusion syndrome, where totally normal people that are totally lucid and have normal lives have one distinct delusion. And sometimes that delusion is not a big deal. But sometimes it is, like they believe the mafia is after them. And during his relationship with Pauline's mother, he passed on his delusion to her through something called folie à deux, which translates to madness for two, which is shared delusion syndrome, where someone who's delusional, who's a dominant personality, can pass that on to a subordinate personality. After confronting her mother and then also confronting Stan at a later date, neither of them said, "This is a lie, you're right, you caught us," because they believed it, and they took to their graves the belief that the mafia was after them. Their biggest concern after Pauline said this isn't true was not that they had been exposed as potential frauds. It was that, oh no, Pauline's going to expose herself to the mafia because she's not using her GPS transponder or her radio or living in the weird world with us. She's going to get assassinated by the mafia. And so even though Pauline never got an apology from her mother or got to really talk about the insanity of this whole situation, because again, her mother and Stan took to the graves the belief that the mafia was in fact after them, Pauline ultimately made peace with the situation by writing a best-selling memoir called Run, Hide, Repeat. It is linked in the description below. Check it out. In November of 2004, 52-year-old Peter Porco and his wife, 54-year-old Joan Porco, were like so many other middle-aged, middle-class Americans. They lived in Del Mar, New York, in a comfortable 2-story home, and they worked for a living. Peter was an appellate court clerk, and Joan was a speech pathologist. They had been married for over 30 years, and they had 2 sons. Christopher was a 21-year-old student at the University of Rochester, and his brother, Jonathan, was a 23-year-old naval officer stationed at a submarine base in Groton, Connecticut. On Monday, November 15th, 2004, Peter woke up to start his typical Monday morning work routine. He got up, he got out of bed, he went into the bathroom, he relieved himself, he looked in the mirror, he shaved, he got dressed in his work clothes, he went downstairs, he put on a pot of coffee. While the coffee was brewing, he unloaded the dishwasher and then put the dirty dishes into the dishwasher and started it. He wanted to get his newspaper, so he went outside, he got his newspaper, but he realized he locked himself out of the front door, so he got the spare key out from underneath the mat, opened the front door, went inside, he sat down, had some coffee, read the newspaper. After a few minutes, he put his coffee cup in the sink, he packed himself a lunch in his lunchbox, and then he headed for the door to head for work. Peter was known as a very reliable employee who was also very punctual and rarely missed work. So when he didn't get to work that Monday morning, the court was a little bit confused. They called him to see if he was okay. He didn't pick up. So they dispatched a court officer to go make sure he was okay. And so the officer arrives at his house. He sees cars in the driveway, the front door shut. He goes up, he knocks on the door. Nobody answers. He tries the handle of the front door. He realizes it's open. So he opens the door and he yells out, "Hey, I'm just looking for Peter." And the door hits something on the ground. He pokes his head inside and looks down, and there on the ground, the thing blocking the door, is Peter Porco's body. He's clearly deceased, and he clearly has a massive head wound. The court officer steps outside immediately, calls 911, local police show up, they go inside, and sure enough, Peter is dead. They go upstairs and they find his wife, Joan, in bed, also with a massive head wound, but she was still alive. Joan was rushed to a hospital where she underwent emergency surgery and then was put into a medically induced coma. Meanwhile, the police began their investigation into who could have done this. They quickly discovered that the home's alarm system had been smashed and a phone line, because there still was landlines at the time, had been cut from the outside, and a screen in one of the windows had been slashed that looked like the way someone climbed into the house. However, nothing appeared to have been stolen because police almost immediately found Peter's wallet with money inside of it still sitting in the house, as well as very expensive jewelry that belonged to Joan still sitting in the house. As they continued to search the house, they discovered a fireman's axe that belonged to the Porcos hidden inside of one of the bedroom closets, and it was very clear this was the murder weapon. The Porco sons had been away during this attack. John was on his submarine in Connecticut, and Chris was at the University of Rochester. And in fact, Chris found out about the attack on his parents when he saw a news report, because this story of this innocent, typical-seeming American couple in a quiet suburb getting struck down by some axe-wielding maniac had gone totally viral, and it was all over the news. And so Chris called the police to get more information about his parents' death. Here's the recording.
Hi, my name is Chris Porco. I was just called by the Times-Union saying that my parents were found dead this afternoon. I was wondering if you had any information for me.
Hey, Chris, whereabouts are you?
I'm at school in Rochester, New York.
Okay, you're in Rochester?
Yes.
Okay, and you're hearing from the Times-Union?
Yeah, they said my parents were found, I guess, dead. I don't know. They didn't say how or anything.
So you will be here probably, you're going to go right to Albany Med?
I don't know. I don't even know where my mom is, but...
Yeah, she is at Albany Med.
Okay. Do you know her condition?
No, because I haven't talked to her. Let me give you my pager number.
As you can tell, Chris is extremely emotional. He's beside himself. He can barely speak. He's so upset about what's happened to his parents. No, actually, he sounds as calm as if he's ordering a pizza, because Chris Porco was actually a psychopath, and he was the one who attacked his parents with the axe. As it turns out, Chris was failing at school and taking out huge loans in his father's name by forging his signature, and his father found out about it. So Mr. and Mrs. Porco write their son a strongly worded email where they tell him this behavior has to stop, and they're very disappointed in him, but they love him and they will help him get back on his feet. Chris responded by driving home in the middle of the night, sneaking into his house and attacking his parents with an axe. While this case is already disturbing and horrific and tragic, it's what happens to Chris's father after the attack that makes it one of the most brutal cases of all time. After being struck 16 times in the head and laying unconsciously in his bed as his son snuck out of his house, Peter suddenly sat up and began his morning routine. He got dressed, he went to the bathroom, he shaved, he went downstairs, he made coffee, he did his chores, he went outside to get the newspaper, he got locked out, he got the key from under the mat, went back inside, he packed his own lunch. When he was finally ready to go, he headed for the door and then he collapsed and he died. Due to the severity of Peter's head wound, his brain was basically broken and it was unable to recognize he had been gravely injured. So in his final moments, he believed it was just a typical Monday morning going about his work routine when in reality, he had a gaping head wound and he was basically dead after the 16th blow to his head. One of the more surprising and heart-wrenching details of this case is that Joan Porco, she did survive the attack, and after she came out of that medically induced coma, she said she forgot all the details of the attack, even though when she was discovered in her bed, she did indicate that Chris, her son, was the attacker. Nonetheless, she got together $250,000 to post Chris's bail, and she allowed him to come stay with her during his trial. And the two attended the trial together, walking into the courthouse hand in hand. Chris was very quickly found guilty of killing his father and attempting to kill his mother, and he was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. Despite the verdict, Joan Porco still speaks to Christopher over the phone and frequently visits him in prison. It's unclear if she still believes he is innocent. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. Give us a timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to take the like button out on your boat for a scuba diving trip. Once they get off your boat and they're underwater, turn your boat around and head back to shore. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also started a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time that's going to do it, see ya. Even if the beginning of the story feels a little bit dry, trust me when I say you want to stick around for the ending. This is easily one of the wildest stories on this channel. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come over your house to play Call of Duty with you, but then give them the NES Duck Hunt remote as their controller. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. The Chundawats were a big, tight-knit, middle-class family who lived in a cramped city in northern Delhi, India. For generations, their family had been farmers living and working out in the desert, but in 1989, their beloved patriarch, Bhopal Singh, decided it was time for a change. That year, he sold all of his farmlands and then used the money from that sale to move with his wife and his youngest son to the city. And over the next couple of decades, one by one, the rest of Bhopal's children and their families followed him out there to the city and moved in with him. By 2007, there were 12 Chundawats all living under one roof. They made their living by running a grocery/plywood shop on the first floor of their house. The store was quite prosperous, not only because the goods they sold were top-notch, but also because the locals just really liked being around the Chundawats. Bhopal was this big, friendly personality that took on a sort of fatherly role in the neighborhood, and so locals began calling him Daddy just like his family did. Bhopal's wife, Narayan, took on a motherly role in the neighborhood, and so naturally was nicknamed Mommy. When she wasn't taking care of her own family, she'd be outside handing out tea to workers on the street or looking after neighborhood kids. The rest of Bhopal's family, which included his 3 adult children, 2 of their wives, and 5 grandchildren, were also often seen down at the store, and they were highly regarded and respected as well. By all accounts, the Chundawats seemed like very successful and happy people that kind of had a perfect life. But in 2007, they would face a crisis when Bhopal died. Knowing how much he meant to that family, neighbors were concerned that the family would fall apart without him. But surprisingly, immediately following his death, it was like the family started improving in all aspects of their life. It was like an already perfect family got even better. They began working extra long hours at their store, and before long, they had earned enough money to open another store and put an addition on their house. They improved their health by changing their diet and cutting alcohol and tobacco out of their lives. Their children, who were already very gifted students, began studying even more and did even better in school. And the whole family, from the youngest to the oldest, became exponentially more devout. While neighbors certainly noticed these changes in the Chundawats, none of them raised any eyebrows. In fact, people were impressed. This incredible family has managed to come out of a huge crisis better off and happier for it. Little did they know that behind the scenes, something totally sinister was driving these changes. Fast forward 11 years to July 1st, 2018. That morning, like every other morning, locals began lining up outside of the Chundawats grocery store, waiting for them to open their doors. The Chundawats were known to be extremely punctual, and at 6 a.m. sharp every day, they opened those doors. But this morning, 6 a.m. came and went, and the store stayed dark and the doors stayed closed. People began calling the Chundawats, but none of them had their phone on. And so eventually, a 79-year-old neighbor decided they would just walk up the steps to the Chundawats' house and check on them themselves. And so up they went, they knocked on the door, they yelled out for the family, but nobody came to the door, everything was off. And so eventually, they just tried the doorknob and twisted it, and it turned. He swings it open, and he yells out the family's name, and as soon as the door flings open, and he can see inside, he nearly faints. He backpedals, he screams, he runs down to the street, and he yells for someone to call the police. Luckily, there was a police officer in the area, and so very quickly they came over and they cleared the crowd out of the way that was forming at the base of the Chundawat steps. They were all looking up to see whatever this neighbor had seen. And before the officer actually ascended the stairs, someone told him what was seen inside of the house. And so he's mentally preparing himself for what he's about to walk into. He walks up the stairs and he pauses right before turning the corner when he's going to actually see inside the house. He takes a deep breath. He knows what he's going to see. He turns the corner, he walks inside, and he's still completely shocked at what he's seeing. He would only be able to stay inside of the house that first trip for about 10 seconds before he too turned around and ran out of there. He would say it was just too much. It was one of the worst things he had ever seen, and that he hopes he never has to see anything like that ever again in his career. Eventually, the police would go back inside the Chundawats' house, and after looking around, they would find 11 hidden diaries. And in these diaries would be the full, awful story of what happened to that family. In the first few days following Bhopal's death in 2007, the family called a priest to lead them in a prayer honoring their lost loved one. And during this prayer, Lalit, who was Bhopal's youngest son, at the time he was in his 30s, he began chanting. And as soon as he did, the rest of his family stopped what they were doing and just stared at him. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. A few years earlier, Lalit had been in this horrible accident where plywood had fallen off of a shelf and hit him in the head, nearly killing him. He survived the ordeal, but the damage to his head left him unable to speak. But now, here he is chanting and speaking. And so as his voice grew stronger and stronger as he was doing this chant, the other family members just continued to watch him and listen to him. And then they began whispering to each other, "Daddy has returned." Following this prayer session, Lalit kept his voice, and he began keeping a diary, the first of the 11 he would ultimately fill. The first few entries in that first diary were fairly normal. They were just reflections on his day or on his life. But pretty quickly, the entries took a major turn. The first strange entry occurred on September 7, 2007. To that point, Lalit had been writing in kind of narrative format about his life and whatever it was he was writing about, but it just kind of abruptly stopped, and in its place was this really deliberate instruction for his family. It said they all needed to get a black and white photo of Bhopal, their patriarch, and put it in front of them, and then pray they're able to rid themselves of their old habits. From this point onward, the diary entries became more frequent, and they stayed in this kind of strange instruction format for the family. It was like it was a growing list of rules for the family to follow. And the tone of these instructions that Lalit is writing out in this diary became more and more aggressive and punitive and hectoring. It was like the family was being punished. But the family appeared to obey all of these instructions. And this was because Lalit told his family that Bhopal had come back from the dead, he had given Lalit his voice back, and he had spoken to Lalit and explained to him that the reason he was back is because he wanted to save his family's souls. Lalit explained that at night, Bhopal would possess his body, and then using Lalit's body, he would write these instructions in the diary for his family to follow. And the idea was, if you follow these instructions, that will set you on the path to saving your soul. His instructions were at first just simple ways to honor Bhopal, but quickly they became really specific directives of how each of the family family members needed to live their life on a day-to-day basis. There were instructions about which food they were allowed to eat and when they were allowed to eat it. There were instructions about which things they could sell in their store, and there were instructions on how to invest their profits, and there were countless instructions on how they should be praying and when they should be praying. Every night, just before 9 p.m., the family was instructed to stop whatever they were doing and head back to the house, and if anybody asked them what they were doing, they were supposed to tell them that grandfather was coming. And so they would all convene in a room inside of their house, and they would wait, and then at some point, Lalit would walk into the room, he would sit down in front, and then right at 9 p.m., he would become possessed by Bhopal, and then Bhopal would lead a 15 to 30 minute long prayer. Eventually, Lalit began observing a vow of silence, and he told his family that if and when you hear my voice again, it's not Lalit, you're only hearing Bhopal. In the eyes of his family, Lalit was no longer Lalit. Lalit had become Bhopal, or I guess Bhopal had become Lalit. But either way, Bhopal was back, and so with the exception of Lalit's mother, everyone in his family began referring to him as Daddy. Over the years this went on, the neighbors did pick up on the family's strange behavior, specifically Lalit's strange behavior. But no one ever said anything about it because despite the weirdness, the family seemed like they were really flourishing. They looked healthier, they were making more money, the grandchildren were excelling in school, and they just generally looked really happy. And so fast forward to June of 2018, which is the month before the neighbor and then police officer sees this horrible thing in the Chundawat household. That month, June, was an especially happy time for the Chundawat family because one of the grandchildren had announced they were going to get married. And so on June 17th, they have this huge engagement party. The whole family's there. They're dancing for joy about this incredible announcement. And then they began shifting their focus to planning this wedding that everyone is so excited about. A couple of weeks later, on June 29th, the Chundawats had their neighbor over for dinner, and that neighbor would later say that nothing seemed amiss, and over dinner, all the family wanted to talk about was this incredible wedding they were planning and how excited they were to go to it. And this wedding was several months away. Less than 48 hours after this dinner, the Chundawats failed to open their grocery store, and so the neighbor goes up the stairs, he opens the door, and he sees 10 members of the 11-person Chundawat family dangling from nooses in the front hallway. They were hanging very close together in a circular pattern that looked very intentional. Their hands and their feet were bound, they were blindfolded with strips of cloth, their mouths were taped shut, and their ears were packed with cotton balls. On the ground underneath them were black stools that had toppled over. The 11th and final member of the Chundawat family, which was the 77-year-old widow of Bhopal, was found dead laying in a bed nearby with a belt right next to her. The initial thought by police is this was a mass murder, but after reading the last few entries of Lalit's final diary, they realized it wasn't. Lalit had convinced his family that just abiding by Bhopal's strict instructions that he gave them in the diary, that was not enough to save their souls. What they needed to do was participate in a ritual he was calling Vat Tapasya, which means worship at the hanging roots of the banyan tree. 8 days before their bodies were found, the family, who agreed to do this ritual, began practicing for it. And every night they'd work on binding their hands and their feet and then unbinding themselves, and they would tie nooses and put it around their neck, and they would tighten them, and then they'd loosen them and take them off, and they'd do it to each other until they were very good at doing all of those things. The day before their bodies were found, the family performed what's called a hawan, which is a ceremony of burnt offerings. And then afterwards, they ordered food and then tied their dog up outside. At 10 p.m., one of the grandchildren and her mother left the house and went to a store and then were caught on camera walking back to the house carrying these black stools that they would later use in the ritual. Just after midnight, it was time for the family to get in position. The parents helped their children put on their bindings, they got them up on their stool, and they put their nooses around their neck and cinched it down tight and told them to wait. And then afterwards, they did the same thing to themselves. At this point, Lalit's mother most likely realized she was not able to climb up onto the stool because she was hurting or she was tired, and so a decision was made to move her into the bedroom. And so she, along with Lalit and Lalit's wife, Tina, walked into the bedroom, and once she was laying down on the bed, Lalit put a belt around her neck, and then he and Tina pulled on it until his mother went still, and then afterwards he took the belt off, put it next to her, and then Lalit and Tina casually walked back towards the front hallway where the 8 other family members were now in position. They're blindfolded with cotton in their ear, they have their noose on, they're just waiting, and Lalit and Tina walk around the room kicking their stools out from underneath them. And while their family slowly asphyxiates all around them, Lalit and Tina bind up their wrists and their ankles, they get on their stool, they blindfold themselves, they tape their mouth, they put cotton in their ears, they put their nooses on, they cinch them down, and then they both jump. The very last line in the final diary that Lalit kept, it says, "Keep water in a cup. I will appear and save when color changes." This ritual was supposed to allow the family to see Bhopal in person. Lalit told them that as soon as they were hanging, the skies would open up, the earth would tremble, and Bhopal would walk right into the room and save them from their death. And they were going to be able to prove that he was there, because not only would they have lived through this ritual, but also Bhopal was going to change the color of the water in the cup that was left out near their bodies. The family had even left the front door unlocked to make it even easier for Bhopal to come in and save them. The Chundawats were not committing suicide. They believed they were going to survive this ritual. This is why just 2 days earlier at that dinner with the neighbor, they were eagerly talking about this wedding that was off in the future they were planning, because they believed they would get to attend it, even though they knew in 2 days they'd be performing this thought tapasya ritual. Ultimately, investigators closed the case as a mass suicide, citing the cause as shared delusion. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come over your house and play Call of Duty with you, but give them the NES Duck Hunt remote as their controller. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's stories are about how sometimes doing what you think is the right thing can actually be the most dangerous choice you can make. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're walking into a building and the like button's right behind you, obviously following you, make sure to turn around, make eye contact, and then shut the door. Don't hold it for them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On a Saturday afternoon in February of 2011, 18-year-old Michael Peary was 1,000 feet underground, crouched inside of a dark cave in Lafayette, Georgia, along with 4 of his friends. As Michael looked around, his headlamp beam bounced off all the low-hanging rocks and underground waterfalls and deep crevices, and it all just kind of felt like some kind of dark and otherworldly planet down here. So this cave that they were in was a famous cave called Ellison, and Michael and his friends had driven over 400 miles from their college town in Gainesville to see it. Ellison was almost 12 miles of tunnels and shafts and crevices, and thousands of cavers went through it every year. It was very popular. Now, to be clear, caving as an activity was not really Michael's thing. He was a marketing major at the University of Florida, and he mostly considered himself to be a pretty quiet person and liked studying or playing in his school band or volunteering with his church youth group. And so crawling through a tiny, pitch-black, very claustrophobic hole hundreds of feet underground was not really his first choice for fun. But Michael was not there today for fun. He was there because his close friend, a guy named Grant Lockenbach, had suggested it. So he had said, okay, I'll go with you. Just now, Michael looked over to where Grant was sitting with his girlfriend, whose name was Carrie, and also they were sitting with 2 of their other friends. And the group of them were all looking through a backpack and sort of taking stock of the various pieces of gear that they had brought along with them. Now, they'd only entered Ellison just a few minutes ago, but already the group had stopped because there was something in this area that Grant really wanted to see. And when Grant wanted to do something, it usually happened. Hence why Michael capitulated and wound up in this cave, because Grant wanted him to. And so, like normal, he went along with it. So Grant, he was the president of their school's Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which Michael, Carrie, and the other two friends were also members of. And when Michael had joined the fellowship, Grant had sort of taken him under his wing and told Michael that he had tons of potential. In fact, he said Michael had enough potential to be the next president of the fellowship. And this had given Michael a ton of confidence, because he really looked up to Grant. I mean, a lot of people did. Grant was just cool. He was a few years older than Michael and was basically like a 6-foot-tall ball of positive energy who was always looking for some adventure to go off and do. Grant had been exploring caves as a hobby for the last 3 years, and he was actually really the only member of their group with any real caving experience. And it was actually this lack of experience amongst the other people that were with Grant, including Michael, that was the reason they were going through an easier tunnel within Ellison that was basically a straight shot through the mountain and did not require much gear like rope or climbing equipment. It was like very beginner. But despite that, despite the low level of difficulty of the caving route they had chosen, they'd brought that stuff anyway, all that extra equipment, because along this easier route, at the place where they were now stopped, was the entrance to a vertical shaft that Grant specifically wanted to climb down, even if he went alone. This shaft was 125 feet deep. So think of like a 10-story building. That is how deep this pit went. But it was actually called the warm-up pit because compared to the other, deep pits in Ellison, it was nothing. Some were way deeper, like over 500 feet. So this was definitely not beginner. This was an advanced thing to be doing, so Grant was going to do it. But again, it's sort of a novice level, more advanced thing to be doing in this cave. Now, Michael watched Grant take the backpack with all the equipment in it over to this pit's entrance, which was basically just a very large hole in the ground that was over near this waterfall, and it was only about a few feet away from Michael. And so Michael walked over to Grant to help set him up, which involved attaching a climbing rope to the rocks that Grant could then use to lower himself into this pit with. This process is called rigging, and it took them a while since really Michael had to wait for Grant to instruct him on every step, because Michael, again, is not an experienced caver at all. But as Michael worked with Grant to get him all rigged up, he found himself peering into the pitch black hole, and as he looked down into what just felt like this bottomless abyss, he felt his stomach kind of flip. He was glad he had not promised Grant that he would go into the pit too, because, seeing it now up close in person, this was terrifying. He did not want to go into this thing. But Grant clearly did. He was excited. And so Michael and Grant continued to get Grant all set up, and then eventually, finally, when Grant was rigged, Michael heard the sound of something pretty heavy sliding off of a rock, and then moments later there was this loud, echoing thud from deep inside of this hole, the warm-up pit. For a moment, Michael was just confused. He didn't know what the sound was. Maybe it was a rock falling into the pit, but he looked over at Grant, and Grant had a very unhappy expression, and he was looking at the ground right next to the pit hole, and that was where their backpack had been, with all the equipment inside of it, at least the equipment that they weren't using, and the backpack was not there anymore. The backpack had just fallen 125 feet down into this pit. Now, obviously, this was not good. They did not want their backpack in this hole, but it was actually worse than just losing their equipment potentially, because in that bag was their only cell phone that they had brought with them. And it was also where they had put all their ropes and other climbing gear. They'd taken some stuff out, to get Grant rigged up here, but still, losing this bag felt really bad. Without its contents, they could easily get stranded or trapped inside of this cave, and they wouldn't be able to call or text anybody. They'd be stuck. And so Michael could actually feel himself starting to panic, but then Grant cut in and played it cool as always, and he said, look, it's no big deal. He would just go down there and he would get it. He was going into the hole anyway, and he was rigged up after all, so he would just go down and retrieve the bag. It would be fine. And then before Michael or, Grant's girlfriend or the other friends could say anything, Grant just, strapped on his harness and a pair of ascenders, which were climbing tools that would help him move down the rope in a controlled way, and he began sort of positioning himself to go down into this pit. And Michael just watched Grant in complete awe. Grant was so confident that he was able to basically make everybody else around him feel calm too. And Michael felt himself calming down just watching Grant. And this was not the only time that Grant had projected calm in the face of danger. During Grant's freshman year, He'd casually climbed up the exterior of one of their school's dormitories just to see if he could do it. And he did do it. And he also had joined the school's ROTC, which is a military reserve training program, and learned how to jump out of planes. So he had skydived, sort of a thrill-seeking activity. And so this moment in the cave seemed like yet another example of why Grant was really such an incredible leader. And Michael found himself hoping that by the time he potentially took over as president of the fellowship, that he could be just as fearless as Grant. But for now, Michael watched as Grant very calmly lowered himself into the hole and then disappeared into the abyss below. And for the next few minutes, it was very quiet, and all Michael could hear was the sound of the waterfall. So he and Carrie and the others just sort of talked amongst themselves and waited for Grant to call back up that he was down there and had successfully grabbed the backpack. And finally, they did hear Grant, and he did call out from somewhere down in the hole. But Michael couldn't really understand what Grant was saying because the waterfall that was kind of blasting nearby was really loud, and also Grant's voice echoed around the cave, which made it hard to tell what he was saying. So at this point, Michael and Carrie and the others were not worried. They figured that this was just an acoustics problem, not a safety problem. So Michael just walked over to the edge of this pit and kind of leaned over and just looked down. But, he couldn't see Grant. He was too far down and it was too dark. And so Michael called out, asking Grant to repeat himself because they couldn't understand what he was saying. And Grant did yell back. He clearly replied to Michael, but Michael still couldn't really make out what he was saying. However, this time, there was something really different about the way Grant sounded. Again, even though he doesn't know what Grant's saying, one thing was definitely clear. Grant no longer sounded like the calm, cool, and collected, fearless leader that he normally was. He was talking really fast, he was repeating himself, he was saying something really, really quickly, very urgently. And even though, again, it wasn't clear what it was, the tone was very clear. Grant was scared. There was a problem. Now, obviously, problems arise when you are rappelling into a 125-foot hole underground in this cave. That, problems can happen. But for Michael and the others, when they sort of realized that something was wrong for Grant, it was really shocking. I mean, Grant is the guy that got other people out of problems. He was the calm guy. Nothing rattled him. And so just to hear him basically panicking, it was really unsettling for those at the surface. And so Michael and the others, they're kind of hit with this sudden realization that, one, it's very unsettling to hear Grant sounding this way, but worse, two, is they're not cavers. They can't go into this pit and save Grant if he needs saving. Not only because they lacked experience, but also all the caving, all the climbing equipment was in that backpack that fell into the pit that's down there with Grant. So there's no way they can realistically help him if he is in any sort of trouble down there. And also, their one cell phone is down in that backpack in the pit. And so unless Grant can figure out whatever problem he's got and get back up here on his own, Michael and the others, without even saying it, knew like they were kind of helpless. And so as this realization is setting in for Michael and the others, Grant goes from trying to talk to them, even though, again, they can't tell what he's saying. He just sounds sort of panicked, to straight up screaming. He's screaming for them. Something is horribly wrong. And so Michael and Carrie, they start yelling down to Grant, trying to get him to clarify what's going on, but you have this waterfall that's causing all this noise and splashing everywhere. It's dark, and Grant clearly is so panicked that he's not even listening to them, and so it's chaos, it's madness. And so Michael and Carrie, they turn to the other two friends, and they say, look, we're going to stay here at this hole and wait for Grant. You two leave the cave, go get help. And so the other two, they rushed off to do just that, while Michael and Carrie just sat there listening to Grant getting more and more hysterical by the second, somewhere down in this hole. They still have no idea what's wrong, but clearly there is an emergency here. And so for a little while, after the friends have gone off, Michael and Carrie, even though they're not really talking to Grant because he's just kind of rambling and yelling and screaming, they can't understand him, they're just kind of shouting down into the hole that everything's going to be okay. We've sent to get help. It's going to be okay. You're going to get out of here soon. They have no idea if he can hear them or understand them. They're assuming that the acoustics are bad down there too. Again, the sound of that waterfall is so loud. It's so dark. And so they're just like having this awful moment. But then what cut through all this chaos was at some point, Michael heard Grant say something that he really did understand. Grant, at some point, in a very high-pitched, almost screaming voice, yelled out, Michael's name. Like he was directly yelling to Michael, like, I need you, Michael, to help me. Now, at this point, obviously the situation has escalated dramatically and already, like, things are bad. And for Michael, this felt like a big deal. I mean, before that, all the yelling and screaming was obviously bad. But Michael, he kind of views himself as, Grant's successor, potentially. He's going to be the next, president of this fellowship. And he looked up to Grant so much, primarily because Grant was like this fearless leader. And so Michael sort of felt like when he heard his name called out, that Grant was specifically sort of challenging him, like, you, Michael, I need you. Michael took on that responsibility. And he felt like, I can't just sit here. I can't just wait. Something needs to be done, and I need to do it. I need to save Grant. And so Michael, he jumped up, and he grabbed the extra harness they still had, and he put it on. And as he was doing that, he could hear Carrie, who, she's seeing what's happening, and she's telling him, don't do it. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to go down this thing. Like, this is dangerous. Or what are you doing? Don't go. And Michael, he just looked at her and he said, I have to do this. I know Grant would do this for me. I'm doing it for him. He needs me. I'm going down. And Michael, he's listening to Carrie, still trying to tell him not to go, but he just said to her, please pray for me. And then he walked over and he attached his harness to the same rope that Grant presumably was still attached to down at the bottom, but stuck for some reason, and into the pit he went. As soon as Michael disappeared into this hole, Carrie knelt down beside the pit, she put her hands together, and she prayed as hard as she could for Michael and Grant to be okay. And after a few minutes, she heard Michael call out from somewhere in the hole. And for some reason, she could actually understand what Michael was saying, which was basically that he and Grant were okay. He was with Grant, but they were just very, very cold. Relief flooded over Carrie, and as she exhaled all the tension she'd been holding in, and as the adrenaline kind of began to leave her body, because now she's thinking everything's okay, she also realized that she too was very cold. She just hadn't been thinking about it. She was so fixated on the safety of her boyfriend and also Michael. After all, she was only wearing a t-shirt, and the cave was very damp, and there's this waterfall kind of spraying water everywhere. It was cold. It was a damp environment. And so she's, her teeth are chattering too. She's cold. And so Carrie naturally yelled down into this hole. She can't see them, of course. She's just yelling into the darkness, what's going on? What's wrong? Is Grant okay? But Michael just shouted back to her, I'm fine, but didn't answer her question about Grant. And at this, Carrie could tell clearly there's something really wrong down there, and it probably has to do with Grant. And so she stood up, she began pacing back and forth, her stomach's in knots, and she's periodically yelling down into the hole to Michael, like, what's going on? Is Grant okay? Are you okay? But Michael, all he would say back to her is, I'm fine. He would just say that back to her. But his response time began to slow down. He wasn't responding to each and every one of her calls. He would just, yell out, I'm fine. But it began to become more and more spaced out as Carrie began to ramp up her questioning, asking more and more what's going on, until finally Michael just stopped answering altogether. There were no more voices coming out of the hole. And so the minutes ticked by, and Carrie, she continued to pace around, yelling out to Michael and Grant, but the only reply she got was the sound of the water from the waterfall lapping up against the cave walls. About an hour and a half later, just before 4 p.m., a man named Anmar Mirza, along with 2 other men, ran into the Ellison Cave with a bag of climbing equipment and medical supplies. Now, there was a bigger team of rescue workers on their way up the mountain behind them that had more gear and more personnel, but that group was moving slowly because it took time to respond to a cave accident, because typically there were a lot of people and a lot of equipment, specialized equipment that was required, and also usually the victims were trapped in, pretty remote and difficult to access places, like tunnels and shafts deep inside of these caves. So Anmar and his team were the initial smaller group that went ahead of the larger one to just kind of get the rescue started. A few minutes after entering the cave, Anmar saw a headlamp beam up ahead in the darkness kind of bobbing around. And as soon as he reached the origin of this light, he found a young woman who was sitting by a large hole, and she was shaking and terrified. She explained that her name was Carrie, and that her boyfriend, whose name was Grant, along with one of his friends, whose name was Michael, were down in this hole, and that Grant had gone in, there had been some issue, Michael had gone in after him, and now, when she called out for them, neither of them were responding. After hearing this, Anmar directed one of his team members to take Carrie and bring her out of the cave, and then once they had left, Anmar put on his climbing gear, and as soon as he was ready, he began to rappel down into this pit. As Anmar rappelled, he's looking straight down into this dark shaft, and at first he can't see anything. But after a little while, he began to see somewhere down below were what appeared to be two lights towards the bottom of this pit, which he assumed belonged to the two men. But before he could actually reach them, he felt something wet and freezing cold splash his cheek. Then he saw something emerge out of the darkness right below him. It would turn out when Grant rappelled down into this warm-up pit, he had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had attached his rig to a section of rock that was directly in the path of a freezing cold waterfall. Now, this alone could have been okay. You can rappel effectively through a waterfall if you're careful. Except what happened with Grant is as he was rappelling literally through the water, like the water is coming off this waterfall, it's hitting him, he got stuck. His rope got tangled. And where he got stuck was literally in the path of the waterfall. So he's stuck in the cave, he can't go up, he can't go down, and he's just getting pounded by freezing cold water. Now, at first, what Grant likely did is kind of flail around to try to get out of the path of this water, but there was nowhere to go. He's in this shaft, there's nowhere to go, and he's just dangling there, and he began trying to scream out for help, but that was why his words were muffled, because the water was hitting him in the face, so he couldn't speak clearly. And then also, as he's just dangling there, very quickly, having that icy water hitting him nonstop would have actually sent his body into shock. And it's like he wouldn't have been able to speak or think anymore. I mean, he was becoming hypothermic. And then, in what was possibly one of his final moments of clarity, he managed to belt out Michael's name. And he said it really clearly, kind of managed to get his face out of the water for a second. And Michael, who trusted Grant completely when he heard his name being called, it felt like it was his calling. He needed to go in there and save Grant himself. And so into the hole he went, and he hooked his rope up into the same exact spot that Grant had, and down he went. And Michael, he did an incredibly brave thing by doing this. And it was something that Grant very likely would have done for him too. But again, Michael really had no idea what he was doing. He was basically just going in blind. However, unfortunately, because he just kind of followed Grant's lead and went down there without a plan, well, in the darkness, as he went down, he eventually reached where Grant was, but got stuck as well. Also, in the path of the waterfall. Granted, he was not nearly as exposed to the water as Grant was, like his face was not getting blasted by water, so he was able to call out and be heard by Carrie. But he also got tangled at the same spot, couldn't move, his body's getting hit by this icy water. And so even though the rescuers did eventually get down to Michael and Grant, by the time they did, it was too late. The two men had froze to death. They basically dangled inside of this hole, getting hit by this water for about 2 hours before their bodies just shut down. In 2013, 2 years after both Michael and Grant died inside of that cave, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission gave Michael a posthumous medal for risking his life to save Grant's. On a Friday night in late March of 1980, an 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman sat on his couch in his Washington State Lodge with a whiskey and Coke and turned on his battery-operated radio to listen to the news. And just a second or two later, he found himself having to jack up the volume of the radio because he couldn't hear it anymore because a couple of his cats in the other room were fighting and yowling and it was causing a whole commotion. Harry had lost track of how many cats he actually had, but it was a lot, maybe a dozen. And even though at this moment he yelled and cursed at them and told them to knock it off, he was actually glad they were out there with him, because he liked their company. 5 years earlier, Harry's wife, Edna, had died. And since then, he had lived alone, minus all these cats. And he also didn't have a lot of neighbors either, so for the most part, he had been fairly isolated the last few years. Also, Spirit Lake, the lake that his lodge was on, was 4 hours south of the major city of Seattle, and pretty far into the wilderness. The lake did get busy in the summer with tourists, but at this time in March, there were only about 60 people that lived there, and they were very spread out. But Harry didn't really mind the solitude. He missed Edna a lot, but he had his cats, and he had his radio, and the jaw-dropping mountain scenery and lake, and he had his whiskey and Cokes. So overall, even though he was sort of a gruff guy, he was actually quite happy with his life. But just then, there was a loud knock on Harry's door. And Harry was not surprised by this. I mean, yes, he lives way out in the middle of nowhere, and he did not expect visitors, but in this case, He knew who it was. And as soon as he thought about that, his face contorted into a scowl. He was really annoyed. At this point in Harry's life, he really had only one problem. And it was a major problem, at least to him. And that was the government. And for the last few days, government agents, like almost certainly the ones that were knocking on his door, had been harassing him, trying to get him to leave his lodge in the wilderness that he loved so much, because they needed to conduct some kind of federal operation and they wanted everybody to clear out. Now, Harry loved his country, and he'd even fought for it during the First World War, but he really did not like authority, and he could not tolerate being told what to do. During Prohibition, for example, which was a period of time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal in America, Harry had simply ignored the law and made his own booze, like he just didn't care. So, over these last few days that these federal agents had come to his house trying to get him to leave, Harry had not been intimidated. He had simply stood his ground. And he figured it was really only a matter of time before the federal government sent a local police officer over in hopes that Harry would be more cooperative with somebody that he likely already knew. But what they didn't know about Harry is that Harry really didn't cooperate with anybody. Not with the government, certainly, not with local police, not with his own family, not with his friends, or not with the two ex-wives he'd been with before finding Edna. He was just somebody who marched to the beat of his own drum. So now, Harry did not get up to answer the knock at his door. Instead, he just waited until the person out there, the visitor, yelled through the door and announced who they were, and not really to Harry's surprise, it was the local deputy that Harry did know, clearly being sent here by the federal agents to try to get Harry to leave. And when Harry still didn't answer the door when the deputy clearly had announced themselves, knowing Harry would know who they were, when Harry still didn't get up, didn't answer the door, the deputy finally, just sort of frustrated, called out, "Harry, are you sure you don't want to go?" Now, even though this deputy was being a whole lot more amicable than the government agents had been, they had been really forceful, basically telling him, "You gotta leave." The deputy here was at least kind of giving Harry a chance to make a decision. Despite that, the question the deputy had asked just made Harry really mad, because leaving his house was just not something he would ever consider doing. Harry had lived in this lodge for 54 years, and 37 of those years were spent running this lodge as an inn, as a business, with his late wife Edna, who was the love of his life. Now, he'd let the lodge go a little after she had died, so truthfully it was kind of falling apart, and it smelled terrible, because of all the cats. But it had been theirs, and now it was his, and he would never give it up. And not only that, but just outside his doorstep was Spirit Lake, which Harry believed was the most beautiful, perfect place in the entire world. It was quiet and serene and situated right at the base of some of the most breathtaking mountains he had ever seen in his whole life. And so to say Harry loved it here was a complete understatement. His lodge and Spirit Lake were basically his whole identity. Harry didn't know if he believed in God, but he did believe in the trees and the lake and the birds that screeched at him at all hours of the day. It was like his home, this area, was his religion. And he certainly was not about to give it up just because some federal authority or government agent or whoever told him to. So all Harry said to the deputy waiting outside was a very firm "good night," which Harry was actually quite proud of himself for, because he had a really hard time not swearing. So this seemed pretty mild. After that, Harry waited to see if the deputy would challenge him or say anything else, but he didn't. And moments later, Harry heard the deputy's footsteps crunching down the gravel driveway and heading back towards his cruiser. After that, Harry leaned back into his couch and smiled to himself and picked up his drink, kind of toasting himself for standing his ground, and at the same time sort of hoping that maybe now, finally, officials would understand that he was not going to change his mind. But that's not what happened. A little more than a week later, on the morning of April 5th, Harry sat in a folding chair in a clearing by his house with his binoculars pressed to his eyes and a glass of whiskey in the cup holder of his chair. This was an area of the woods near his house he called his cocktail lounge, where he'd often go to relax with a drink. It was covered by a thick canopy of evergreens, but it also had a great view of the mountains and also the lake. But Harry was not here to relax. He was actually on very high alert, because the woods were absolutely crawling with federal agents and local law enforcement officers. Harry could literally see them right now through his binoculars, walking around the various camps they had set up all over the mountainside and also near the lake. And there was nobody to stop them, because everybody else who lived in this forest had bowed to the pressure and left when told to. which meant Harry was quite literally the last resident still fighting the good fight. Now, so far, officials had not physically attempted to force him out, but now that Harry saw them assembling all over the mountainside, he had to wonder how long he had before they did try. But at the same time, he also knew that he had one piece of very important and very surprising leverage over the authorities, and that was that over the past couple of days, Harry's refusal to leave his wilderness home just because the government told him to had turned him into a media attraction. Reporters had heard about what was going on, and they'd started coming to his house. Now, usually, Harry just did not like the press. Even though he clearly listened to the news himself, he still thought of the press, thought of the media like they were vultures, always looking for dead meat and chaos. But Harry also really liked to talk, and he had a lot of very strong opinions. And now, seeing his beautiful lake inundated by outsiders, Harry realized he had to take full advantage of this media interest in him if he wanted to stay in his home. Because the way he saw it was the government could really not make him do anything against his will if the whole world was watching. So over the next month, Harry gave a lot of interviews. And pretty quickly, he became kind of an international celebrity. He was this single older man standing up to something way bigger and way more powerful, which was sort of admirable, although people didn't really understand it, but it was still a big story. It was very interesting. But more than that, it seemed like the public just sort of liked Harry. In his interviews, Harry would swear and yell and rant and rave and tell reporters about how no authority figure would dare try to get him out of his house.
No, I'm not going to leave. You're damn right I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here. Damn right, this is my home. It's going to have to come and get me. And no authority could take me out of here. No authority dare.
And he'd also talk about his life, just telling these crazy stories that had nothing to do with the wilderness, like about the whiskey that he'd bottled and distilled during his Prohibition days, which he called Panther Pee, and about his relationship with his late wife and how they used to dance together at the edge of the lake, or his war stories from World War I. I mean, this guy was just really quite fascinating. And so by the time May rolled around that year, Harry went from being bombarded by the government to being bombarded by the media. Today, this would be like going crazy viral, where everybody's seeing you on their feed. But this is 1980, and so people got their news from newspapers and the television and the radio. But those mediums were all full of Harry, and people were kind of obsessed. Everybody from average citizens to school kids sent Harry fan mail, and reporters and news crews came to Harry's in droves, and some even took helicopters just to get there more quickly. And Harry, if he was being honest, he sort of relished all the attention. A few months earlier, he'd been happy with his quiet life, no phone, and he just had his 1,000 cats for company. But now, it's like the whole world cared about him, and it was pretty cool. A few weeks later, though, everything changed. On Sunday, May 18th, the sun came up on Harry's lodge, and the woods around it were totally quiet for the first time in weeks, because Harry in some ways had won. He had kept his word, and he'd stayed strong and refused to give in to the government's demands to leave. And finally, the government had backed down. And the sheriff had even come by the day before to tell Harry that, okay, no one's going to come by and ask you to leave anymore. It's on you. And so now, on May 18th, as Harry was getting up, it was just him, the lake, the trees, and the big, beautiful mountain. And then, at 8:32 a.m. that morning, a deafening boom shook the earth. It would turn out the media was not totally finished with the story of Harry R. Truman. In fact, what happened on the morning of May 18th, 1980, would in many ways make Harry even more famous than he already was, because Harry didn't live at the base of just any old mountain. His lodge was situated directly at the foot of Mount St. Helens, which was an active volcano. The government operation that the federal agents and local law enforcement were trying to run here was an evacuation. They were not trying to impede on Harry's rights. They were trying to save him. But Harry was so convinced that the land he loved so much, that he had lived on for nearly 60 years, would not hurt him. And so he ignored the authorities' repeated warnings. But Harry's decision was the wrong one. And on May 18th, he paid for his mistake. Because that morning, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending an avalanche of searing lava and mud directly onto Spirit Lake and Harry's lodge, killing him and his cats instantly. His remains were never found. 57 people died during this eruption, including Harry. Today, in that area, Harry has both a trail and a ridge that are named after him. So in a way, he remains a part of the mountain that he loves so much. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that are all connected under the theme of stranger than fiction. But they really couldn't be more different from each other. I mean, these are 3 very diverse stories, ranging from almost comical to very dark. But regardless, I know you're going to like them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please follow the like button to the grocery store, and every time they're not looking, secretly steal items from their cart. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One morning in October of 2015, a receptionist sat at her desk at a sports medicine center in Birmingham, Alabama, and scrolled through her boss's upcoming surgery schedule on her computer. The receptionist worked for a famous orthopedic surgeon named Dr. James Andrews, and because of his notoriety, his schedule was typically packed. And so her job, for the most part, was just to go through his schedule all the time and make sure nothing conflicted. And so as this receptionist scrolled through the schedule, she saw that over the next couple of days that Dr. Andrews did have several surgeries and there actually didn't appear to be any conflicts. And so she began moving on to the next part of her job, which was to alert upcoming surgery patients about their upcoming surgery and to make sure that all their information and the timing of the procedure were all in line with whatever they were expecting. And so the next person up to get surgery by Dr. Andrews was this minor league baseball player whose name was Brady Feigl, and he was having an elbow surgery, and he was supposed to come in the following morning. So the receptionist called the number on file for Brady, but it actually wasn't Brady's phone number. It was Brady's baseball team's athletic trainer. And so, this guy picks up the phone and the receptionist says, "Hey, just so you know, Brady has a surgery tomorrow morning. It's his elbow surgery. Just trying to confirm the details and make sure he understands what he needs to do to prep for it, etc., etc." And so after she ran through her spiel, the trainer just kind of paused for a second and there was silence on the line. And then the trainer said to the receptionist, there's got to be a mistake here because Brady already had that surgery. He said Brady had gotten it done 6 months earlier, and as a result of the surgery, had to sit out basically the entire baseball season. So there was no mistaking it. He had had the surgery, it was done. But the receptionist, as she's hearing this, she's like, no, that doesn't make any sense. Because the receptionist actually remembered Brady Feigl. He had come in recently for his consultation for this elbow surgery, and he was a really unique looking guy. I mean, he's 6'4", he had bright red hair, a big beard, and also he is a professional baseball player. Like, this is a unique guy that's coming in for a unique surgery that's related to baseball. And so the receptionist is like, no, he came in recently for his consultation. He still needs the surgery, I'm sure of it. And so what ended up happening next is the receptionist and the trainer started going back and forth, kind of trying to describe Brady Feigl to make sure they both were talking about the same person. But of course they were, because how many 6'4", professional baseball player pitchers with this particular elbow problem that were coming to this clinic for an elbow surgery were there? This had to be the same guy. But how could they both be right? That the trainer's saying, well, my Brady Feigl already got it done. And the receptionist is like, no, he's scheduled to come in tomorrow because I had a consultation with him a couple of days ago. They couldn't both be right. But they couldn't understand how this could be possible. But the explanation for this that they did eventually figure out, you just have to see to believe. It would turn out the receptionist and the trainer were both right. Dr. James Andrews was scheduled to perform an elbow surgery on a 6'4", red-haired, big-bearded minor league pitcher named Brady Feigl the following morning. And Dr. James Andrews had also performed the same surgery on another 6'4", red-haired, big-bearded Brady Feigl, who also was a minor league baseball player, also a pitcher, who hurt his elbow months earlier. There were literally 2 Brady Feigls that didn't know each other, that looked the same, did the same sort of really unique job, minor league baseball player, that also went to the same clinic to get the same surgery at roughly the same time. But somehow or another, the clinic put the wrong contact information for the wrong Brady. And so the guy who was supposed to get surgery the next day, they accidentally put in the contact info for the other Brady Feigl because they confused them, because they look exactly the same and they have the same name and they're getting the same surgery. So you can see how the mistake happened. And so it was not until this surgery mix-up that the 2 Brady Feigls learned the other existed. They did not know each other. And when they met each other, I mean, they're spitting images of each other and they do the same job and they have the same issue with their elbow. I mean, it was like this incredible coincidence. But believe it or not, they did do a DNA test because they're thinking we've got to be related, right? Nope, they're not related. They are just absolutely perfect doppelgangers. Hey guys, just want to remind you that year-round we have amazing MrBallen merch available all the time. It does not sell out. It's called Ballin Basics. You can get it at shopmrballen.com. These are different than the unique drops we do periodically. Ballin Basics, again, available 24/7, are things like our skeleton hoodie and t-shirt, our flannel blanket, all the stickers we have. There's a bunch of cool stuff, and it's available right now at shopmrballen.com. All year, you can get this stuff, some great stuff. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you don't gotta wait for the seasonal drops. You can go right now and get anything you want at shopmrballen.com. Year-round, it's available. Ballin Basics, check it out. Around 1:30 p.m. on January 4th, 2020, a 25-year-old woman named Stav Harari and her boyfriend, whose name was Dean Shoshani, looked out the window of their apartment, which was located in Tel Aviv, Israel. Their apartment was located on the top floor of a brand new complex, and from that position, they had a great view of the whole neighborhood, at least normally. But today, their view was pretty much completely obscured, because there was this horrible thunderstorm outside. Tons of rain and hail. I mean, they could barely look out their window. It was just like water and hail blasting against the glass. And so Stav and Dean, they look at each other, and it's pretty clear both of them are thinking the same thing. So this couple, they've been together since they were super young, and they really had just begun to transition into adulthood together. And so in this transitional time, they were just starting to make real money, but they really didn't have a lot of money. They'd put a lot of whatever they had into this apartment, and they also had recently purchased a car. And so the two of them, as they're looking at each other, they're thinking about that car, their investment. And with this huge storm out there, there's a chance the storm could damage that car. And they couldn't have that. They didn't have the money to fix it. Like, they needed that car. And so they both were like, you know what? Let's go down to the parking lot and move the car just to make sure it does not get damaged. So Dean grabbed the car keys, and then he and Stav left their apartment, went into the hallway, and walked down to the elevator. They pressed the down button, and then a moment later, the elevator car opened up. There was nobody inside. Stav and Dean stepped in. They hit the button that would bring them down to the parking lot, and then the doors closed, and the elevator began to go down. And as they were going down, Stav and Dean were quiet, just sort of waiting, anxious to see if their car had already been damaged. They didn't know. And so down it went, top floor again, so it's kind of a long ride, and they get really close to the floor they're waiting to get off at, when suddenly the car kind of comes to an abrupt stop. And for a second, both Stav and Dean are thinking, okay, well, I guess we must be at the floor. I mean, this is about where we should have stopped anyways. And the two of them are just staring at the doors, waiting for them to open up. But they don't. And after what felt like too long of a waiting period for the doors not to open, Stav reached out and hit the button that opens up the doors. But when she pressed the door open button, they didn't open. Nothing happened. At this point, Stav began to panic. And she turned to Dean and said, what do we do? We're stuck. We're trapped. But Dean said, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's probably just some small malfunction. It'll start working again soon. No big deal. But within seconds of that exchange, the two of them heard a very familiar sound. And when they looked at where the sound was coming from, they both began to scream. At the same time this was happening, another resident of this complex, a young man named Eli, happened to be nearby when he heard screaming. and he found out that the screaming was coming from the elevator shaft, and the doors were shut on his side. And so he runs to the doors and he listens, and very clearly, just beyond these doors had to be people who were stuck in the elevator, and they were screaming for help. And so instinctively, Eli grabbed the outside of the elevator and he tried to pry it open, but he just couldn't get them to budge. And the whole time, Staub and Dean on the inside are freaking out, screaming, pleading with someone to get them out. And so Eli, he turns and starts yelling for other people who were also nearby to come over and help. And before long, there was a group of guys over at the elevator doing everything they could with Eli to pry this thing open, but they just couldn't. And the whole time, Staub and Dean are inside sounding more and more desperate. And so Eli finally pulled out his phone and called the emergency services line. However, despite Eli pretty quickly alerting the authorities about this, ongoing crisis here, this elevator issue, it would take over an hour and a half for first responders to finally arrive to the apartment building because of this treacherous storm. There were loads of other problems in the city. But when they finally arrived at Staub and Dean's apartment and they got to the elevator, it was already too late. It would turn out, after Staub and Dean got stuck in the elevator and they're hitting the button, waiting for it to open, but nothing's happening, well, that familiar sound they heard was water rushing into the elevator. They looked down and saw water filling up this space that they can't get out of. And they began to panic and scream and beat on the doors as the water level slowly continued to rise because their parking lot was not outside. It was underground. And the big risk to anybody who parked in this lot is during big storms, this lot was known to flood. And so the couple had gone down to move their car to avoid flooding, not to avoid hail damage. But where this elevator car had stopped was underground. And so the parking lot did begin to flood, and that water found its way into the actual elevator car. And so Eli and those other people who were nearby who went over to the elevator and tried to open it, they were also standing in water. They were very well aware of the fact that if they couldn't open these doors, Staub and Dean are going to drown. And Eli, he didn't call the emergency services line once and call it good. He called 16 times because he's watching as the water is rising and rising and no one's shown up yet. And so eventually, Eli and the others, they had to abandon the elevator and basically swim out of the parking garage as they're listening to the sound of two people, Staub and Dean, still trapped inside of the elevator car. And so as they swam out of the parking garage and no first responders arrived, they knew what had happened. Clearly, they were going to drown. And so they listened to those screams until they stopped. And then finally, first responders showed up. And when they got there, they literally had to use scuba equipment to dive down the elevator shaft, which by this point was totally submerged. And then when they reached the car, they had to cut a hole in the ceiling. And then they pulled Staub and Dean out. And even though they rushed them to the hospital, unfortunately, they both had already died. On the evening of July 2nd, 1993, a 49-year-old politician named Maslin Idris paced around the living room inside of his home, which was located in a suburb of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Maslin was feeling very anxious because tonight, in his home, he was going to have a very important meeting. So Maslin was already a very successful politician. He was a state assemblyman, which is sort of like a state congressperson. But what he really coveted, the thing he wanted more than anything else in his political career, was to become the state's Menteri Besar, which is sort of like being the state's governor. But to get this role, Maslin had to be appointed. And realistically, he didn't know if that was going to happen. And that was in part because recently he had felt like his political power was sort of, slipping away from him. And on top of that, he was getting older and he sort of felt like his popularity was waning too. And so he felt like, in order for me to get appointed to become the state's Menteri Besar, I really need to find a unique way to reclaim that political power and popularity. And that was going to be the central focus of the big meeting at his house that night. So Maslin continued to pace around, anxiously checking his watch, waiting for these people to show up. And then sure enough, late that night, he heard a knock on the door. And he hustled over to the door and he made sure he looked okay. And then he opened it up. And standing in the hallway is this unbelievably beautiful woman who's flanked by these two men that he didn't know. And immediately, Maslin is just completely drawn to this woman. She had long dark hair, this huge smile, and her eyes. I mean, they sucked him in. It was like she was, hypnotizing him or something. I mean, she really looked like a celebrity, at least as Maslin imagined celebrities look up close. This woman's name was Mona Fandey. And actually, to some degree, she was a celebrity. Back in the 1980s, she had released a pop music album that had been very popular all over Malaysia, and so she was kind of famous in Malaysia. Now, in the early 1990s, Mona was done singing, that part of her life was over, but she had launched this brand new second career post-music that, to some people, it seemed like that actually made her more notable and more famous than her singing had. These days, Mona was a highly sought-after professional shaman. So in Malaysia at this time, shamanism was pretty popular and mainstream. Shamans were these people who claimed to have supernatural powers, they could heal people and bring them prosperity. And so it wasn't uncommon for the really well-known shamans to be called upon by very powerful people, like, politicians, let's say, to sort of leverage their powers to increase their clout and their influence. And so Maslin saw Mona, who at the time was arguably the most famous shaman in the entire country. He saw her as his meal ticket. She was going to be the way that he reclaimed the power he needed so he could be appointed as the state's Menteri Besar. And so Maslin very excitedly welcomed Mona and the two men, who were her husband and her assistant, into his home. And, even though Maslin had expected to see Mona tonight, I mean, he knew she was the one who'd be performing this ritual tonight, he still couldn't help but feel totally starstruck by her. And so as a result, he had a lot of nervous energy, and he began sort of rapid firing, asking her questions about, how quickly will I see results, and how's this gonna go, and how successful are these things really? And Mona, as she's just looking at him and smiling, she just eventually reaches out as he's talking and just puts her hand on his shoulder and says, "It's okay. Why don't you show my husband and my assistant where the room is, where the space is that we're going to be doing this ritual tonight?" And at this, Maslin just totally shut up and he nodded. He sort of got the hint that he was sort of being too much here. And he led them into this other room that he had cleared out for tonight. There was nothing on the ground. It was like a vacant room in his house. And right away, the assistant, he began spreading flower petals all over the ground, while Maslin began speaking to Mona's husband to work out payment details. I mean, this was not a free thing that he was getting. It was going to cost him the equivalent of tens of thousands of US dollars to get what he wanted here, to gain his power back. But Maslin didn't really care about how much this cost in money, because to him, it was absolutely worth it. And so once the payment details were handled, and Maslin was, ready, and the assistant had finished putting all the flower petals out, Mona walked over and told Maslin to come with her. And so he followed Mona, and they went into the ritual room that again is covered with flower petals, and she told Maslin to lay down on his back in the middle of the room. And so he did that. He laid down, and he's looking up at Mona, and her assistant and her husband are off in the background. And Mona's got that big, dazzling smile, and she's staring right at him. She says, "Close your eyes and clear your mind. And all I want you to do is just focus on your desires for the future. What riches do you want to come to you? And focus solely on those." And so Maslin did this. In his mind's eye, he pictured himself becoming more politically powerful and more popular and landing the job of his dreams. And he's sort of narrating what he's saying out loud. And Mona's telling him, good, keep going, keep picturing those things. And then at some point she's like, "Look, I want you to picture riches raining down from the sky on you," sort of symbolizing you getting these things that you want. And so Maslin did that, and he began picturing the gold and the silver falling from the sky, landing on him. And he's narrating what he's feeling and seeing, and at some point he was so fixated on this idea of riches coming from the sky that he swore he could literally feel the gold and silver actually hitting his body. And at that point, when he was actually feeling something, is when the ritual was done. A little over a year later, on September 12th, 1994, the famous shaman, Mona Fandey, glided her way through a crowd of photographers on a street just outside of Kuala Lumpur. Mona was dressed to the nines. She had red lipstick on, her hair was all styled up, she had beautiful clothes on, and, as she maneuvered through the crowd, she sort of feigned like she didn't want the attention, but she totally did. So it would turn out the ritual that she had performed on Maslin a year earlier had made Maslin incredibly famous. And in turn, it had made Mona even more famous than she already was. And so the paparazzi, they were desperate to get a photo of her because of her unbelievable fame. And for Mona, even though she acted like what she really cared about was being a shaman and helping people achieve their dreams and to heal and gain in prosperity, even though that's what she would say, the truth was, ever since she had that big hit, that pop music album that had launched her into the stratosphere, ever since then, she had been chasing fame, and now she had really nailed it. I mean, she was like an icon in Malaysia. And so, as she maneuvered past the paparazzi and everyone's clamoring to get her attention and to get her photo, she thought to herself, my plan has worked perfectly. Except, it's important to understand that, Mona wasn't really famous as much as she was infamous. And it really stemmed from that ritual she performed on Maslin. Because what she did to Maslin is she actually just ritualistically executed him. Except it would turn out Maslin wasn't even her first victim. He was her 8th victim, at least as far as we know, and she just got caught after she killed Maslin. When Maslin was laying in that room and the ritual's going on and he's being told to picture all these, gold coins and silver bars raining down on him, well, while he was doing that, and critically, he had his eyes closed, Mona grabbed an axe, raised it up, and brought it down into the middle of his chest. And so this ritual murder was designed to lead to somebody getting more power and more fame, except that person was not really Maslin, it was Mona. I mean, Maslin did become extremely well known for being a victim of Mona, but it was Mona who suddenly was the talk of the entire country. I mean, she was all over the news, and she was beautiful. And so it's like this crazy dichotomy of this unbelievably attractive woman who's also a serial killer. I mean, this is the stuff that just makes the news over and over and over again, and Mona loved it. And so when Mona was walking past that crowd of paparazzi and they're all taking photos of her, that was actually her walking to her murder trial. Every day, she would basically treat that walk up the steps to her murder trial as like her personal red carpet with all the paparazzi taking her photo. She'd dress up in these lavish outfits and smile for the cameras on her way to be tried for murder. And then ultimately, she was convicted of it and sentenced to death. But she was totally unfazed because for her, again, it was all about gaining this incredible notoriety, and she had succeeded. It was like the ultimate shaman move, and she had done it. On the day of Mona's actual execution, she was going to be hanged along with her assistant and husband. They too were found guilty. On her walk to the gallows, we have all these reporters and all these photographers, and she's still flashing smiles and treating it again like it's her own personal movie premiere. I mean, she didn't care at all that she's literally about to be killed. And then literally her final words as the noose is being put around her neck were, "I'll never die." Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On a cold night in early February of 2010, a group of friends gathered around the table at a restaurant inside of a French ski resort. They had been out on the slopes all day, and now they were warming up and relaxing with some mulled wine by the fire. Eventually, a cell phone buzzed, and one of the friends, they looked at their phone and immediately frowned. Then, without saying anything, they excused themselves and stepped away from the table to talk. And then when they came back, they were pale, their hands were shaking, and the others asked them, are you okay? Who are you talking to? But this person, they just shook their head, grabbed their coat, and said they had to leave right now. Someone they cared about very much needed their help. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all the foam in their mattress with rocks. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Saturday, February 6th, 2010, 61-year-old Alan Lelu set up the ironing board behind the couch in the living room of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. From the kitchen, he could smell the beef bourguignon simmering on the stove, but Alan and the 37-year-old woman who was cooking the beef bourguignon were not talking. The woman's name was Alexandra Nicola, and Alan had actually bought this house for her and her 10-year-old daughter. Alexandra used to be Alan's assistant, but over the years, they had developed a really close relationship that was much more like father to daughter. Now, Alexandra had not worked for Alan in a number of years, but, they remained close. And also, remember, Alan literally bought her this house. And so as a result of this bond they had, Alan found himself visiting her quite a bit at this house, helping out where he could. And he also paid for her car and also for their vacations. And Alan could afford to be this generous because he was a very successful, high-powered producer of circus shows, which were a huge moneymaker in France. Lots of companies booked circus shows for end-of-the-year parties for their employees, and Alan had lots of major contracts. And so as a result, Alan's office was in this fancy chateau in the countryside, and his wife actually lived in this luxury ski town near the Swiss border, and Alan was constantly traveling all over Europe for work. But this life could also be a grind. Just in the past 24 hours, Alan had traveled more than 1,200 miles, meeting with potential clients and scouting new performers. So he put a lot of value on the time where he could escape to Alexandra's house, where he could recharge in the quiet of the suburbs, and obviously spend time with somebody he cared a lot about. Now, Alan knew all of his friends and coworkers thought that he and Alexandra were blatantly having an affair here, and he was sure that's what his own wife assumed too. And this was fair, because after all, Alan did have lots of extramarital relationships. He also engaged with sex workers all the time, and he really didn't even try to hide any of it. He and his wife, Elizabeth, they lived in separate homes, and they sort of had this understanding that she can have this life, and he can have this life in exchange. However, Alan's relationship with Alexandra really was different. It had always been platonic. They'd never even kissed or held hands. Alan had no kids of his own, and he genuinely enjoyed playing the role of, doting father and grandfather to Alexandra and her daughter respectively. But now they were in this big fight, and Alan was anxious to repair it. Alexandra's daughter was out of the house for the weekend, so he and Alexandra had planned to have this nice dinner tonight before Alan had to head out again on business on Sunday afternoon. But Alan, somewhat stupidly, had brought up Alexandra's past, and they'd ended up getting into this horrible fight and just continued to yell at each other ever since. Alexandra was very defensive about her troubled history. When she was a young woman, she had moved to Paris and she had fallen in love and she had had a baby, but the baby had tragically died, and her relationship with her love had fallen apart, and so she had spiraled into very self-destructive behavior. By the time Alan finally met her in 2002, so this is 8 years before they were in this house having this big fight, Alexandra was really struggling. By this point, she had a 2-year-old daughter, and she was really struggling to provide for her because all she could muster in terms of work was like this combination of minimum wage jobs and side hustles. And so when Alan had hired her as his, full-time secretary, it had completely transformed her life. But, deep down, sometimes she seemed more resentful of Alan's power than grateful for his help. It's like he had total control over her well-being, and she didn't necessarily like that. And so with that as context, Alan left the ironing board and walked into the kitchen, hoping that Alexandra had cooled down enough that they could actually have a real conversation here. And so once he was in the kitchen, he sort of looked over at Alexandra and couldn't really tell where she was at, and then he turned, opened up the fridge, and just kind of stared inside of it, not really looking for any food or drink or anything. He was just hoping that Alexandra would say something to him. And to his relief, Alexandra did turn around and kind of playfully swung her dish towel at him, telling him that he had to wait for dinner. She didn't seem mad at him anymore, so Alan felt very relieved, and he smiled and closed the fridge, and then he told her to come sit with him and have some wine while they waited for the laundry to dry so she could iron it. A few minutes later, they both sat down on the sofa with their wine glasses, and Alexandra asked Alan how business was going. He told her it was good, which technically it was. His company was on track to bring in around 4 million euros that year, which is the equivalent of about 5 million US dollars. But despite how things looked on paper, Alan was pretty stressed. He made the majority of his money through contracts with companies, but he was not the only person competing for those lucrative contracts. His number one competitor was another circus owner whose name was Michel de la Rue. And recently, Michel had been beating Alan on one contract after another. And it was starting to feel to Alan like Michel was actually targeting Alan's contracts, trying to steal them from him rather than trying to cultivate his own clients. Alan told Alexandra that on Monday, he had a very important meeting in Vichy, which is a city in central France about a 4-hour drive south of Alexandra's house. At this meeting, Alan was hoping to win a big contract, as long as Michel didn't steal it out from under him. Alexandra put her hand on Alan's arm and told him, "Don't worry." She said she was sure his meeting on Monday would be a huge success and they could celebrate in a few weeks on the ski trip that he had booked for the two of them and her daughter. Then she put down her now empty wine glass and went to go do the laundry. As Alexandra disappeared into the back of the house, Alan just kind of sat by himself for a minute. He was looking forward to the vacation that she had mentioned, in part because Alexandra had been a lot busier lately with her new boyfriend, a 42-year-old IT engineer from Paris named Yves Bernard. Now, Alan and Yves got along just fine, but he could tell that, Alexandra and Yves were getting pretty serious. They might even get married. And Alan couldn't help but worry that eventually, if that happened, Yves might start to resent him for sort of stepping in as this paternal figure in Alexandra's life, that perhaps he would come off as being sort of overbearing. But he was not going to let that fear wreck the evening. So as Alexandra came back now with the laundry, picked up a book from the coffee table, and took the last sip of his wine. The rest of the weekend passed by quickly, and by Sunday afternoon, Alan was back in his car, headed back out of town. But what no one would realize until much later was there was actually a second car following closely behind him. The following day, on the morning of Monday, February 8th, Alan Lilu's wife, Elizabeth, was drinking a coffee inside her home in the mountains when her phone rang. She picked it up and she heard the voice of Alan's assistant, Sylvie. And Sylvie sounded very worried. And she said she was calling to see if Elizabeth had heard from her husband recently. And this was pretty strange, because Alan was not the type of person to just disappear from work without telling his secretary. So Elizabeth told Sylvie that no, she hadn't heard from Alan in a few days. And then she asked Sylvie, why? What's going on here? And as Elizabeth listened to Sylvie's answer, she felt herself growing really nervous. Because apparently, Alan had this very important meeting in Vichy that morning, but he had not shown up for it. In fact, he'd never even checked into the hotel in Vichy where he was supposed to be staying. Sylvie said she had already reached out to several of Alan's friends and business contacts, but nobody had heard from him. And he was not answering the repeated phone calls to both of his cell phones, which appeared to be turned off. None of this made any sense to Elizabeth. Alan was famous for spending entire days on his various phones. She couldn't even recall a time when he'd been unreachable, even briefly. So Elizabeth told Sylvie she was glad she called, but she would take it from here. Then Elizabeth hung up the phone with Sylvie and called the police. Hey guys, I have some pretty big news. I know many of you are excited to hear. I am going to be doing another live storytelling tour this year. You can find me in a bunch of cities, including new ones on the West Coast and across the United States, where I have never played before. Plus, I'm really excited to share that I will also be performing in an international city, since so many of you have been asking me to visit. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. And guess what? Tickets for this tour are available right now at tour.ballenstudios.com. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, they range from general admission to VIP. Again, that's tour.ballenstudios.com. I'm also going to be giving away a trip to meet me at one of my live shows. And so if you want to enter for your chance to win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. Again, that's FANDIEM.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. A week and a half later, on February 19th, a young police officer knocked on the front door of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. Now, up until this point, Alan's case had been treated as a simple missing persons case, with the local police in Alan's wife's hometown handling the inquiry, which was pretty basic. But now, enough time had passed without Alan being found and no evidence coming in that the original report had been kicked over to the crime division because they were thinking this could potentially be a kidnapping or something worse. This young officer was here at this home because it was the last place Alan was known to be before he went missing. The door of the home opened and a thin blonde woman looked out. The officer asked her if her name was Alexandra Nicola, and she said yes. When he explained to her why he was there, Alexandra looked immediately concerned and invited him inside. And as she led him into her living room and offered him a seat on her couch, the officer looked around, taking stock of the space. It was clean, but a bit cluttered, with toys that appeared to belong to a young girl scattered about. The officer scanned for any signs of a physical fight or violence of some kind, like damage to the walls or the furniture, but there was nothing that stood out, nothing concerning. Alexandra began asking the officer pretty anxiously all these questions about, what was going on with Alan. Was he hurt? Was he in some kind of danger? Like, what do you know? But the young officer just shook his head and said, for now, they really didn't know much. He was just here to try to build a timeline of Alan's last known movements. And so speaking of that, he asked Alexandra to please walk him through what she remembered about her last interaction with Alan. The officer took careful notes as Alexandra began to rattle off all the details she could remember. She said that Alan was like a surrogate father to her, and he had come over on the evening of Friday, February 5th. He had been there on Friday, also on Saturday and Sunday, and then he had taken off on that Sunday because he had to go to Vichy for this big meeting on Monday. She told the officer that after he left for that meeting, she hadn't heard from him, but that was pretty typical. She said their relationship was not remotely romantic, it really was platonic. And, he didn't always check in the way, a spouse would. This is more like really close friends. The officer nodded while he wrote down what she said. Alexandra seemed very helpful and appropriately worried, but he was suspicious of the idea that she and Alan were not romantically involved at all. So, before he left, he asked to see the rest of her house, in part just to see what her reaction would be. If she said no or got defensive, he would probe a bit more deeply. But she immediately agreed, and she actually took him all around the house, showing him anywhere he wanted to go. And what he found is the rest of the house seemed just as normal as the living room and the entryway. She eventually brought the officer back to the door and promised him she would call if Alan reached out. And so after leaving Alexandra's house, to be thorough, the officer actually went door to door up and down Alexandra's street, asking her neighbors what they remembered about that particular weekend and over the past several days, seeing if there was anything that contradicted what Alexandra had said. But everybody, more or less, confirmed Alexandra's story. Alan was indeed a regular visitor in the neighborhood, and several people did remember seeing him on the weekend in question and said that really nothing had seemed off. So eventually, the officer just left and went back to the station, and when he got there, he wrote a report highlighting Alan's last known destination of Vichy. Over the next week, police in Vichy, as well as in the ski town where Alan's wife lived, followed up on the loose threads of the investigation. They pored over Alan's cell phone history and his bank account and credit card transactions, which all showed no activity after he left Alexandra's house on February 7th. They also spoke to his business connections and his friends, but no one had heard anything. And they even put in a request to the car company, Audi, for the GPS data that was stored in Alan's car, which was an Audi Q7. Now, the investigators knew it was entirely possible that Allen had chosen to disappear. I mean, he was very wealthy, he had lots of connections. That was a possibility, that he had basically chosen to be gone. And if that was the case, it would be pretty difficult to find him. However, it was a lot harder to hide a car that logged all of its travel data. And so whether Allen's disappearance was voluntary, accidental, or the result of foul play, the police knew finding his Audi was likely the best hope they had of knowing where to even look for Allen. On February 26, 2010, so 19 days since Allen was reported missing, a detective named Pierre Martin stood in a secure impound lot in the city of Orléans, France, looking at Allen's gray Audi Q7. The GPS data that police had requested from Audi had come back a few days earlier, and it had led detectives to a surprising place. So again, the last place where Allen was known to have been before he vanished was leaving the home of his surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicolas, near Chartres, France, and heading to Vichy, France for a business meeting. But his Audi had not been found in Chartres or Vichy. Instead, it had been discovered in the parking lot of a train station in Orléans, which was in between those two cities. And so to the police, it sort of looked like he had gotten halfway to his destination and just stopped. Now, when they found this car, the first thing they did is they just put it under surveillance for 2 days to see if maybe Allen or somebody else would return to it. For context, the parking lot where this car was in a pretty rough area where violent crime and sex work were pretty common. So, I mean, any number of people could potentially, break into this car or who knows what. It just seemed like a seedy area where something might happen here if we keep watching. But nobody had shown up. So finally, they just towed the car to the impound lot for forensic technicians to process it and look for evidence. And Detective Martin was here to watch that process. The forensic techs circled the vehicle and began taking photos of the outside and also dusting for fingerprints. There was no visible damage anywhere on the outside of the car, and there were no traces of any effort to try to break into the car. Plus, Allen's briefcase and luggage were clearly still inside the car, which meant, the fact the car was found where it was likely not a product of a robbery. This didn't seem like somebody just stole his car. It's here and it has nothing to do with Allen's disappearance. It seems like how this car got here is connected in some way to what happened to Allen. And, sort of going down that path, it seemed more and more likely that what happened to Allen probably fell into the category of foul play. However, when the technicians opened up the car doors and began dusting for prints inside, the upholstery was disappointingly clean, which doesn't exactly sort of enhance the idea that foul play happened here. It just sort of seems like what's going on. But after a few minutes, after, kind of thoroughly scanning the inside of the car, one of the techs pushed the button near the driver's side that opened up the trunk. And then after it was open, Detective Martin walked around to the back to look inside and see what was in there. And what he saw was this bulky object wrapped in a pink sheet. And right away, Martin had this sinking feeling in his chest as one of the techs reached forward with a gloved hand and pulled the sheet back. And pretty much immediately, Martin's suspicions were confirmed. Underneath that pink sheet was a body, a man's body, fully clothed and curled in the fetal position. There was no doubt this was Allen Lilu. But there was no visible blood or wounds or bruises anywhere on his body, and there was no blood in the trunk. When Detective Martin reached in to try to move Allen's body to further examine him, he found his body was already incredibly rigid with rigor mortis. The coroner told Martin that she would hopefully have some answers for him after she did the autopsy. The weather over the past few weeks had been pretty cold, which was good for evidence collection because it basically meant the trunk had sort of acted like a refrigerator and preserved Allen's soft tissue. As the coroner wheeled the body away, Martin just stood there staring at the now empty trunk. He had no theories about when or why or even how Allen had died. All he knew was that this was now officially a murder investigation. Detective Martin returned to his office at the police station and got to work. Since Alan's body was found in Orleans, he was now in charge of the murder investigation. His first step was to review all the witness statements and other evidence that had already been gathered by the other departments. And right away, the picture they painted told Martin that this was going to be a very complex investigation with lots of suspects and multiple locations. Alan was a workaholic who was always on the move, and he had no apparent connection to the city of Orleans, where he had ended up. In fact, he rarely seemed to spend more than a few days in the same place. He didn't live with his wife. Instead, he seemed to bounce between his office and a series of hotels, with stops at the home of a woman named Alexandra Nicola in between. According to reports, Alexandra had been interviewed, and she said that Alan was at her house the weekend before he disappeared. And so this made her the last person to see Alan alive, which, in Martin's mind, clearly made her a suspect right off the bat. However, Alexandra's story about Alan leaving her house on Sunday, February 6th, matched up with the data Martin had from Alan's car, cell phone, and credit card records, which all showed that Alan really did leave her house and went to Orleans on that day, and then, for reasons unknown, stopped communicating or spending money. Maybe that was the day he was killed. Right off the bat, like the police officer who originally visited Alexandra and took down her original story, Detective Martin found it pretty hard to believe that her relationship with Alan was not romantic. It just seemed like, based on how frequently they apparently saw each other and the fact that Alan was buying her things and, bought her house and paid for vacations and things like that, it just seemed like there was more to the story than what he had been told. But even though that did totally cast some level of suspicion on Alexandra, there was also just the logical side of it for Detective Martin, which is like, okay, the size difference between Alan and Alexandra was stark. I mean, Alan was 240 pounds, a really big guy, and Alexandra was just very small and petite. Now, is it impossible for her to kill him and put him in the trunk of the car in Orleans? No. But it just makes it sort of unlikely. And so that's just sort of floating in the background of Detective Martin's mind. But for now, what Martin found himself much more interested in was some of the other information that Alan's business associates and wife had supplied. First off, Alan apparently had lots of affairs with lots of women. And so that meant every one of those women, and any husbands or boyfriends or other romantic partners of any kind connected to them, were also suspects. It also meant that Alan's wife, Elizabeth, had a motive to want her husband dead. I mean, basically, he's cheating on her openly all the time. That's got to be motivation for her to do something to him. Now, Martin didn't think that Elizabeth literally would have done the killing herself, because she was actually 400 miles away at her home when her husband died. But she certainly had the financial means to hire a hitman. And the second thing that Detective Martin got from the associates and from Alan's wife was Alan's business dealings were both very high stakes and very ugly. Alan's employees and colleagues clearly respected him, but they also described him as a very tough boss and a ruthless business person. He could be very loud and abrasive, and he had already made his fair share of enemies in the circus business, which was already known to be a cutthroat industry where a lot of money was flying around. And so because Martin had been handed this murder investigation, and really there's like an overwhelming number of people that could have been involved here, instead of just, not being sure where to start, Martin just assembled a team of his very best deputies, and they set to work literally re-interviewing everybody, and from that, making a list of suspects that they deemed were appropriate. Three weeks later, on March 17th, Detective Martin walked into an interrogation room in the Orleans police station, and he sat down across from a relatively fit-looking 50-year-old man who was waiting for him quietly and apparently very calmly. The man's name was Michel de la Rue, and he was Alan's biggest rival in the circus business. He was also, at this very moment, Detective Martin's #1 suspect in this murder. Martin and his team had spent the last few weeks conducting dozens and dozens of interviews, and Michel's name had come up more times than anybody else's. And this was because, immediately after Alan disappeared, Michel had begun contacting Alan's clients, trying to get them to all sign new contracts with him, sort of a pretty cutthroat and cold thing to do. And Detective Martin had done the math on these contracts Michel was going for, and they added up to the equivalent of millions of dollars, which in the detective's mind was a very compelling motive for murder. Maybe Michel killed this guy specifically to gobble up these contracts. And not only that, but the coroner had by this point come back with Alan's cause of death. He had been strangled using some kind of ligature like a rope or a belt, and it likely took between 5 and maybe 10 minutes for Alan to actually be strangled to death. So the idea is someone's actively strangling him for that long. That is a long time to be right there on top of somebody killing someone. And then the scratches that were found on Alan's legs suggested that his body had been lifted into the trunk after he was already dead. So the death struggle, the actual strangling, clearly took place outside of the trunk. And so all that meant whoever killed Alan had to be pretty strong. And looking at Michel now, Detective Martin thought that he did fit the description. He seemed like a pretty fit, strong guy. However, as Martin began asking Michel questions and watching his face and body language for signs of anxiety or defensiveness that could suggest he was hiding something, what he found was Michel seemed pretty open and very straightforward, like he was not hiding a thing. Michel immediately acknowledged poaching Alan's clients, but he just shrugged as he explained it. That was business. He said he was sure if somehow the positions were reversed, Alan would do the same thing to him. And also, he said he had an airtight alibi. On the weekend, when the coroner believed Alan had been killed, Michel had been hundreds of miles away skiing. And then Michel produced this folder full of these receipts and all these phone numbers, and he handed it over to Martin, who took it, and he told Michel, okay, sit tight. And then the detective got up and he left the interrogation room and he handed over this folder to another detective to check out. But after that, Detective Martin did not go back into the interrogation room. Instead, he grabbed another detective and told them to take a shot. The idea was to sort of have a good cop, bad cop sort of dynamic to see if maybe that would rattle Michel. And so Detective Martin watched from behind the two-way mirror as the next detective walked inside and took a stab at, breaking Michel. But their conversation basically played out the same way that Martin's had. So Martin signaled for another detective to go in there and have them take a shot. But they too had a sort of run-of-the-mill conversation with Michel, and they didn't make any progress. And then finally, after basically hours of cycling different detectives into the room to try to catch Michel in a lie, Detective Martin felt a tap on his shoulder. And when he turned around, it was one of his deputies who told Martin that unfortunately he had called all the people that Michel had given them information for, all the witnesses from the ski resort, and he had also even called the manager of the ski lodge. And basically, Michel's alibi checked out. He clearly had not been physically able to kill Alan. He was at that ski resort at the time of the murder. At this point, Martin knew he could not just keep Michel indefinitely and just keep trying to catch him in a lie. Even if there was some possibility here that he was involved in this murder, at this point, there just wasn't enough evidence. And so he had to let Michel go. A few days later, Martin was back at his desk combing through reports when a uniformed officer came up and told him there was somebody at the front desk who really wanted to talk to him. And this was exactly the kind of news that Martin had been hoping for. He had recently put out a statement to the local papers basically saying, hey, if there are any witnesses out there, please come in and talk to me. And he hoped that whoever this was potentially a witness. And so Detective Martin followed the uniformed officer out to the lobby, and there he saw the person who had come in to see him. It was this man who appeared to be in his early 50s, who was dressed all in black with these shiny black shoes and glasses. And Martin wondered if maybe this was a business contact of Alan's. And as he went up to shake the man's hand, he sort of felt himself getting excited. But then this man introduced himself, and when he did, Martin had to resist the urge to just turn around and walk away right there. Because the man said his name was Remy Saint-Touren, and he was a professional psychic. Martin did not believe in psychics, and he was annoyed with the police officer for even bringing him out here to meet this person. And so Martin was literally about to just tell Remy to, thanks for coming in, but I don't have time for this. You need to go. But then he thought better of it, because Martin was really having no luck with this case. There had been very little forensic evidence recovered from Alan's car. There were no usable fingerprints, and while the bedsheet Alan's body was wrapped in did have some DNA on it, it didn't match anything in their system. And then the business leads that Martin had been pretty excited about hadn't panned out either, and he'd found no evidence that anyone in either Alan's personal or business circles took out a paid hit on him. Martin's team had also spoken at length to Alan's surrogate daughter, Alexandra, and all the women he was having affairs with, and all the sex workers he had engaged with, and none of them, nor any of their boyfriends or husbands or partners, made sense as the killer. So, out of a mixture of a little curiosity and a lot of desperation, Martin brought Remy the psychic back to an interrogation room and asked him what he thought. Remy explained that he had heard a news bulletin about Alan while he was driving, and when he heard it, he had a vision that was so vivid that he actually had to pull over. He said he saw Alan Lilu as clear as day in this physical struggle with a woman. Remy didn't know her name, and he couldn't describe her, but he was certain that a woman was somehow involved in Alan's murder. Martin was disappointed because, unsurprisingly, this just sort of felt like a generic stab in the dark by somebody parading around as a psychic who could see things that nobody else could. It just seemed like he threw this random generic thing out there as if it was some big revelation, and it just didn't feel like it was. But Remy wasn't done. He went on to say he was sure that Alan was not killed in Orleans, even though that's where his body had been found. He said Alan's body had been taken away from the murder scene and actually placed in the trunk after he was dead. And this caught Martin's attention, because the coroner had been certain that Alan was strangled in one place and then placed into the trunk afterwards for transportation. But critically, the police had not released that information to the press, specifically because they wanted to be able to weed out fake tips. And so for Remy to say that, how would he have access to that? Now, Martin knew this could have just been a lucky guess by Remy, but it just seemed so, on the nose that he began considering what else Remy had said. This idea that, okay, Alan was struggling with this woman. That was something that, Martin had not really considered. He had sort of ruled most women out as the potential suspect because of how big Alan had been and how physical this murder had to have been. So it just seemed more likely that a big, strong man was responsible for the killing. But now, Martin wasn't so sure. And suddenly it seemed entirely possible that, maybe a woman really did do this. And so eventually, Detective Martin thanked Remy for coming in and sharing his ideas about the case. And then after walking him out of the station, Detective Martin sped back to his desk, because Martin had an idea. Lots of people in Alan's life had told the police investigating his murder that Alan had had lots of extramarital affairs. Now, Detective Martin and his team had spoken to all the women they could possibly find who had had these affairs with Alan, and basically all of them had been ruled out. However, now, after talking with Remy the psychic, something about the location where Alan's body was found was jumping out at Detective Martin. The part of Orleans where Alan's car had been parked was pretty sketchy, it was crime-ridden, and critically, it was known for being a hotbed for sex work. Now, Martin already knew, clearly, that Alan engaged with sex workers. It just seemed like that was one of the things that he did, and they spoke to numerous sex workers and ruled them out as being suspects. And so for the most part, sex workers were not really on Detective Martin's radar as, primary suspect pool. However, now with fresh eyes, he was thinking, maybe the reason Alan was in Orleans was because he was there to meet a sex worker, and while he was there, something went wrong, and it resulted in his death. So, Detective Martin spent the next few days absolutely scouring Alan's laptop. Now, the forensic techs had already been through it once, looking at all of Alan's emails and business records, but Martin was looking at something different. he was using the laptop to search through all the websites where Allen had found sex workers to go visit. Basically, what he was doing is making a true exhaustive list of every single sex worker he had ever really engaged with. So this is an even bigger list than they had before. There were dozens of names and profiles to sift through, and as Martin found them, he would send members of his team out to speak to all the women he possibly could. But as he was doing this, Detective Martin discovered that really none of these sex workers that Allen was engaging with had any connection to Orleans, and they also did not appear to have any real issues with Allen himself, at least based on the messages that were on his laptop. However, as Detective Martin dug deeper and deeper into this laptop, going further and further back in time, he eventually came to one new profile, this woman named Marie Eve. And when he took in who this woman was and got a picture of her and saw her information, he knew right then and there he had solved the case. Based on the entire police investigation, as well as a confession from the killer, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Allen Lelou on the day he was murdered. The killer found themselves standing behind Allen, and inside they were burning with rage. Allen seemed to think he was so much better than the killer, just because he was this powerful businessman, and the killer was just a sex worker. And the killer had tolerated Allen's behavior because, Allen had money. But now, Allen had pushed it too far, and the killer felt like they had to shut him up for good. Allen's belt lay nearby, and impulsively, the killer grabbed it and lunged forward and looped the belt around Allen's throat. And at first, Allen struggled. He reached up. He's trying to pull the belt off. He has no idea what's happening, but the killer just held on tight. And for several minutes, there's this unbelievable death struggle going on. And Allen, he's fighting. He's a big guy, and he's getting close to pulling this thing off. But then something sort of unbelievable happened. The killer had sort of braced themselves against an object behind them, and so their back is up against it, and they're pulling as hard as they can with this belt against Allen's throat. And as they're leaning back, the object they're up against suddenly broke. And because, the killer didn't let go of the belt and is applying max pressure, when they fell backwards, it created almost like this whiplash effect. Their body tumbles, and all that force is driven into Allen's throat. And what happened is that sudden whiplash crushed Allen's larynx, and he immediately went still. And so just for good measure, the killer held on for a couple more minutes, pulling as tightly as they could across his throat, really ensuring that Allen was dead. And when Allen did not move at all, eventually the killer let go of the belt and stood up, their heart pounding, just sort of taking in the scene. Then, as reality began to set in for the killer, they realized they needed help getting rid of this body. I mean, this is a huge guy. How are they going to get rid of it on their own? So the killer called their accomplice. And the accomplice was hundreds of miles away in a ski resort, but they immediately told the killer to wait and they would drive to them. Sure enough, the next day, the accomplice arrived and they helped the killer load Allen's body into the trunk of Allen's car. Then the killer climbed into Allen's car and drove it to the train station in Orleans. Behind them, as they made this ride, police would realize much later there was a second car being driven by the killer's accomplice. The killer and the accomplice would abandon Allen's car and his body in Orleans, and then together they would drive away, and shortly thereafter, they would actually get married. Because the killer was Allen's own surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicola. Alexandra's troubled past that she was very defensive about included the fact that she was actually a sex worker under the name Marie Eve. Her accomplice was her new boyfriend, Yves Bernard. So Alexandra and Allen had fought previously about her, troubled history, and she was especially mad that at one point Allen had implied that Alexandra's daughter could sort of end up like her, as if that would be a horrible thing. So on Saturday, February 6th, when Allen brought up Alexandra's daughter, just sort of in conversation, For Alexandra, something snapped. It just felt so disrespectful that he, again, was talking about her daughter. And sort of out of impulse, she grabbed the belt, wrapped it around Alan's neck, strangled him, and ultimately stumbled backwards and crushed his larynx and killed him. In a way, it was sort of true what Alexandra had told the police when they initially questioned her, that Alan had left her house in his car on February 7th, and she had not seen him again. What she had left out was that Alan was already dead in the trunk of his car when he left. Alexandra Nikola confessed to the murder of Alan Lilu and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her boyfriend, Yves Bernard, was sentenced to 2 years for concealment of a dead body. The couple has since been released, and together they have a child who was born before Alexandra went to prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button has a big public speech they have to give, offer them a mint right beforehand. Except this mint is actually a plaque disclosing tablet. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In early 2020, a very popular Russian Instagram influencer named Ekterina Didenko was getting ready to celebrate her 29th birthday. She, along with her husband and some of her influencer friends, were planning to enjoy the occasion at a popular spa in Moscow, Russia. The group rented out a private section of the spa that included a steam room and a small indoor pool. And then once the reservations were made, Didenko and all of her influencer friends began eagerly talking about how excited they were about this party on their various social media accounts. When the day finally came, February 28th, which was Didenko's birthday, Didenko, her husband, and the 8 other people they invited, they all descended on this spa. So they go inside, they go back to their private area, and it's great. There's food, there's alcohol, there's music, they're jumping into the pool, then getting in the hot tub, and everyone's just having a great time. Everyone's taking pictures and filming and live streaming. I mean, it's really going as well as it possibly could be. And then at some point, Didenko's husband signals the rest of the group, minus Didenko, and they all begin to pull out these white hazardous materials suits. Imagine what you would see in a movie if there was some huge chemical leak, a full body white suit with a mask. And so they're all putting on these hazmat suits, and they give one to Didenko, who puts it on as well, and they tell her this is part of her big surprise. Now, it's unclear if Didenko actually didn't know what was going to happen next, or if she's just pretending to be surprised because it would do better on social media, because this is all being filmed and she's an influencer. But either way, she puts on her hazmat suit, and once everyone has their suits on, Didenko's husband wheeled in this huge cooler like you would bring to a picnic, and he placed it right on the edge of the pool. When he opened the lid, the crowd all gasped and laughed and smiled and filmed as these huge clouds of smoke or steam came pouring out of it. What it was roughly 55 pounds of dry ice. Dry ice is just frozen carbon dioxide. It's commonly used for things like refrigerating perishable goods for long periods of time because dry ice stays cold for a really long time. Also, because of the huge white gas clouds that come off of dry ice, it's also very commonly used as a sort of spooky decoration because you have these very cool white clouds going everywhere. And in fact, that's what Didenko's husband planned to use this dry ice for. He was going to dump it into the pool and create those big white gas clouds all over the pool. The reason they call it dry ice is because as it starts to heat up, it doesn't melt into a liquid state the way frozen water does. Instead, it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state. Dry ice is considered to be quite hazardous if it's handled inappropriately, and while these partygoers all had their hazmat suits on, it's unlikely they were actually wearing them for safety. It's far more likely they were wearing them because it would look good on social media and would kind of hype up the stunt they were about to do. And so after the dry ice was revealed inside of this cooler, Zdenko's husband and another of the partygoers grabbed the sides of the cooler and they dumped its contents directly into the water. And as soon as the dry ice hit the water, it rapidly began to warm up, which caused a massive, almost explosion of carbon dioxide gas to completely fill the lower half of the room. Now, none of the partygoers are even a little bit fazed by what's happening. They don't realize how dangerous this actually is. And so they're just filming and laughing and kind of thinking this is so funny. And then Zdenko's husband actually leaps through the cloud into the water and kind of disappears below. And then shortly after that, two other partygoers would also leap into the pool. One of the main reasons dry ice is considered to be so hazardous if handled inappropriately is because dry ice emits that carbon dioxide gas, which at high concentrations will displace oxygen. So imagine if you're in a very small room that has very poor ventilation. If you had lots of carbon dioxide in there, you would suffocate. And so this indoor pool was a small confined space with poor ventilation. And so the 7 people on the pool deck, shortly after this dry ice has been tossed into the pool, they started to realize it was really hard to breathe because the oxygen was basically being sucked out of the room. And so they were able to turn and actually run out of the pool deck before it was too late. Meanwhile, Zdenko's husband and the other 2 people who leapt into the pool, when they came back to the surface, they breathed in thinking they would be breathing in oxygen, but instead they breathed in an entire lungful of carbon dioxide, which in addition to displacing oxygen at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation, it is also poisonous at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation. And so when the 3 of them surfaced, they breathed in this poisonous gas, which caused 2 of them to immediately pass out and then just die, while the third, Zdenko's husband, he managed to stay conscious enough that he was able to climb barely out of the pool, and he tried to get to the door, but he couldn't get out in time. Eventually, he was pulled out and rushed to the hospital, but he would later die, not only from carbon dioxide poisoning, but also from having gone without oxygen for as long as he had. On Saturday, September 30th, 2017, a staff member at a North Wales country club noticed water leaking out of the bottom of an outside wall of one of their many bungalows. These bungalows, which were generally just vacation rentals, were single-story white structures situated up on this beautiful green hillside. The staff member, after seeing this leak, they just turn around and go back to the front office and they tell their boss about it, and then shortly after, 2 maintenance workers were sent out to check on this leak. And so these 2 workers, they go over to this bungalow and they knock on the front door. But after a while, when no one comes to the door, they pull out their master key and they begin to turn the lock. And as they do that, they yell out just in case, hey, we're here just to check on a leak. We have to come in. It's a potential emergency. And so they open up the door, they swing it open, and no one comes to the door. It's still silent. And they're looking into this property. And what they see is on the left, from their perspective, is a kitchen. And on their right is a living room. It was basically one big room that had been designated for 2 distinct functions. And so they yelled out again into this bungalow, hey, we're coming inside. We're just checking on this leak. And then they just walked straight across past the living room and past the kitchen to the back of this property where they reached a door. And this door led into a bedroom, and this door was shut. And so just as a precaution, they knocked on the bedroom door, but nobody came to the door again. So they opened up the bedroom door and they looked into this room, and on the right side of the room, tucked up against the right wall, were 2 twin beds where the head of each bed was tucked up against the wall. And then in the middle of the room, at the base of these 2 beds, was a pile of unopened luggage. And so to the 2 maintenance workers, this told them that someone clearly was staying in this bungalow. Either they had just arrived or they were getting ready to leave, but apparently they were not there right now. And so the workers walked around the luggage and around the 2 beds. So they walked on the left side of the room all the way to the back where there was another closed door, and it went into the bathroom. And based on where the leak had been coming out of the structure, they believed it would be coming from this this particular bathroom. And so again, they get up to this door and they knock on it because, they want to make sure no one's in there, but there's more silence. And so they open up the bathroom and right away they see water all over the bathroom floor. But as they scan around the bathroom, they look at the sink, they look at the shower, the toilet, none of them are overflowing or running. So it was not any of the usual suspects that had caused this leak. However, there was one other area in the bathroom that could have caused a water leak, and that was the airing cupboard. An airing cupboard is typically where you keep a hot water heater. It's basically like a walk-in closet where the majority of the space is taken up by this heater. And also generally people put in shelves in front of the heater to store their linens and towels and that sort of thing. And in this bungalow, the airing cupboard had its own door and it was right in the bathroom. And this door to the airing cupboard was right to the left of the door that led into the bathroom from the bedroom. And so these two workers, they reached over and they opened the door that led into this airing cupboard. And as soon as it swung in, they could tell right away where the leak was coming from. And they could tell right away they had a much, much bigger problem. 7 days earlier, 60-year-old former policewoman Mary Isherwood arrived at the North Wales Country Club. She and her ex-husband had for a long time owned one of these bungalows. However, they almost never stayed in it. They basically used it as an income property, renting it out to vacation goers. But they had recently decided that they wanted to actually sell the property. And so before the sale became final, Mary had told her ex-husband that she just wanted to go and spend a week actually enjoying the property and actually take a vacation there. And so originally she and some friends were going to go to this bungalow and spend a week there. But right before they were going to leave, Mary's friends all said they couldn't make it. And so Mary decided she would just go on her own. And so Mary arrives at this country club. It's late at night when she gets there. She gets to the bungalow. She puts her luggage down in her bedroom. And then instead of just kind of getting settled in and going to sleep, she decides she's going to go exercise. Mary was incredibly fit and healthy. She loved playing golf and running and exercising in general. And she knew the club had a pool. And so she reached into her luggage and she just pulled out a bathing suit. She switched into that and then she went down to the pool and did some lap swimming. After that, she came back to her room where she took a shower and then she climbed in bed without any clothes on. That was just how Mary liked to sleep. And then at some point in the middle of the night, Mary woke up to go use the bathroom. And so she hopped out of her twin bed. She walked around to the door that led into the bathroom. She went inside, she did her business. And then afterwards, as she was attempting to go back into her bedroom, she accidentally grabbed the door handle of the airing cupboard, which was right to the left of the door leading back to her bedroom. She opened it up, it swung inward. She stepped into the airing cupboard, which was totally pitch black. And as she walked in, she might have bumped into the shelves or realized, this was the wrong turn. But as soon as this happened, the door behind her had actually shut. And so she's inside of this tiny airing cupboard, realizing, okay, this is not where I need to go. I've made a silly mistake. She turned around to grab the door handle to open the airing cupboard back up again. But when she grabbed the knob, it disintegrated in her hands. It broke into multiple parts and fell to the ground. Now, the space she is in is pitch black. She has no way of knowing which parts go where for this doorknob. And so by touch, she reached down and she grabbed all these pieces and she probably tried to put them together and put it back on this door to try to get it open, but she just couldn't do it. And so eventually, Mary would have realized this is a pretty serious situation. She was staying at this bungalow by herself, and she was not expected to check out for another week. So no one was going to be checking on her, and without this doorknob, she could not open this closet door. It was a hard wooden door, the locking mechanism was solid, there was just no way to open it without this doorknob. And so Mary began banging on the door and screaming out for help, but her bungalow was not actually connected to any other structures. It was a standalone. And so her voice did not carry very far, and the banging sounds she was making, those also did not carry very far. And so no one heard her. And so after several hours, she's just standing in this closet, probably thinking to herself, how in the world did I get myself in this position? But after the initial shock of this totally bizarre situation she was in had worn off, she decided to act. And so she turned away from the door and she faced towards the back of this closet. She would have been face to face with a row of shelves, but she wouldn't have been able to see the shelves because it was totally dark. And then beyond the shelves, farther into this closet, was the actual hot water heater. There was no wall behind the shelves. Basically, there was a space behind the shelves where this heater was. And so Mary grabbed one of these shelves and she managed to break it off the wall. And then she turned around and used this piece of wood and tried to smash the door, but very quickly realized that was just going to do nothing. However, she began striking the wall right next to the door, and she realized she could break through the drywall. She was starting to kind of burrow a hole. And so maybe she thought to herself, if I can just build a hole big enough right next to the door, I can reach through the hole and maybe open this cupboard from the outside. And so she began using the shelf to smash this wall, and she's burrowing as fast as she can, but the progress must have been very, very slow because she decides she needs a different tool. So she turns back around, so she's facing the shelves again, and she breaks down a few more shelves to clear a path to get to the water heater. And then once she could step past the shelves, once there was a path, she got right in front of this water heater, and then by touch began feeling around for any pipes extending off of the heater. And when she found one, she got a good grip of it, and she began yanking and tugging on it until she managed to rip a piece of pipe off of the hot water heater. Now, as soon as she did that, she now had a pipe that was a far better tool for burrowing and creating this hole in the wall. However, as soon as that pipe broke off, cold water began leaking out of this hot water heater, the water that had not been heated yet. And it was being sprayed all over the inside of this cupboard. Now, this was a very small space, and so there was no way for Mary to get out from under this cold water. And so it was a shocking and probably very painful experience. But she now had her tool and figured, okay, this is awful, but I'll just use this tool, I'll burrow this hole, I'll get this cupboard open, and I'll get out of here. And so with the water raining down on her, Mary used her new piece of pipe and began digging and burrowing at that spot right next to the door. But after a while, probably several hours, she struck a brick wall. There was no way she could actually push through this wall and reach around and open the cupboard door. There was nothing she could do. It was a dead end. And so totally devastated and probably very exhausted from all the energy she used to burrow this hole, she stopped. She's still getting rained down on by all this freezing cold water. And instead of just totally giving up, she just turned and faced the wall that was leading into her bedroom. She began digging again, using this tool all over again to now dig a new hole on this other wall, most likely hoping that she could literally burrow a hole big enough that she could actually crawl through into her bedroom and escape. And so after several more hours of digging as fast and as hard as she could, while also periodically banging on the door and screaming out for help, she did eventually push through into her bedroom. However, in a cruel twist of fate, when she did finally poke through this wall, there was no bricks in the way, she hit what felt like another dead end. But in fact, what it was a picture frame with a glass cover across it had been screwed onto the wall in her bedroom. And this painting was right over where she was digging this hole. And so in her totally exhausted and panicked and saddened and scared state, she hits the back of this painting. And again, it's pitch black and she's feeling through the hole most likely. And she's touching this hard back of this painting. And she's realizing, oh my goodness, I've hit another dead end. There's nowhere for me to go. Even though in reality, she could have very easily just broken through that frame and then maybe made the hole a little bit bigger, and then she could have squeezed through it and escaped. But she didn't know that, and so she eventually just slouched to the ground and accepted her fate. 6 days later, when those two maintenance workers opened the airing cupboard door, they found Mary's body slumped up against the wall inside this closet. She had died of hypothermia. It would turn out other residents of the other bungalows nearby heard banging coming from this bungalow on Saturday night, the night that Mary actually got stuck, and then they also heard the banging the following morning, on Sunday morning. But none of the other residents reported it because they believed it was just construction or some other maintenance work. However, there was one couple staying in one of the nearby bungalows that thought there was something off about this banging. And they told each other, if the banging persists past 5 p.m. on Sunday, so that's the day after Mary got stuck, This couple told each other that if it continues past 5 p.m., we'll report it. But as it happened, Mary stopped banging on the walls and yelling for help right around 5 p.m. on Sunday. And so this couple, right as they're getting ready to go tell the front desk, the banging stopped, and so they stopped worrying about it. It's unclear how long Mary survived after she stopped banging around 5 p.m. on Sunday. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours, it could have been days. Mary's family would ultimately sue the country club for negligence. However, the outcomes of this case have not been made public. On July 30th, 2013, 56-year-old Roger Miro grabbed a bag of trash from his apartment and then walked out into the hall. He turned right and walked down the hall until he reached the trash chute, which was right on the side of the wall. He opened it up. It was like a mailbox. He opened it up. He dropped his trash bag inside. He closed the trash chute and then walked back to his apartment. When he got back inside, he instinctively reached down to his right pocket to grab his cell phone, but it wasn't there. So he grabbed his left pocket, wasn't there either. He checked his back pockets, he's fishing around, and he realizes he doesn't have his phone. So he figures, okay, I must have put it down somewhere in my apartment. Now, Roger was legally blind, so it made looking for small things in his apartment quite difficult. But nonetheless, he began looking all over his apartment for his phone. He started in the kitchen, he looked all over the place, checked all the surfaces, no cell phone. He went to the living room, to the bedroom, to the bathroom, but there was no cell phone. And so Roger thought maybe when he walked to the trash chute, he might have dropped the phone in the hallway. And so he left his apartment, he turned right, and he walked along, retracing his footsteps all the way to the trash chute. But all along the way, there was no phone on the ground. And so as he's standing in front of the opening to this trash chute, he thinks to himself, maybe I accidentally put my phone in the trash bag that I have now just dropped down this trash chute. And so as Roger is standing there wondering what he's supposed to do, one of his neighbors walked out into the hall and looked down and saw Roger standing there kind of inquisitively looking at this opening to the trash chute. And they asked Roger, what's going on? And Roger explained the whole phone situation. And the neighbor said, well, hey, why don't you go down to the first floor and ask the manager if you can get the key to the trash room on the first floor where all the trash goes. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He turned and made his way to the elevator, and the neighbor went back inside of his apartment. Roger went down to the first floor. He went to the manager's office. He knocked on the door. And when the door opened, the manager was obviously very busy with something. And Roger would say, hey, I'm just looking to get into the trash room. I think I might have accidentally thrown my phone away. And I just want to have a look in the trash to see if I can find it. Now, this manager knew he was not allowed to let anybody who lived in the apartment complex go into that trash room on their own. It was a dangerous space. And so the manager was supposed to go in there with them if they needed to go in and look around in the trash. But right when Roger went up to the manager's office, the manager was waiting for a very important phone call and so couldn't really leave his office. But the manager kind of empathized with Roger and felt bad for him and said, okay, you know what? I'll just give you the key. You can go in there on your own and go looking for your cell phone. I hope you find it. And when you're done, just bring the key back here. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He took the key, he left the office, and he made his way down the hall to the trash room. And when he got there, he unlocked the lock and went inside. A few hours later, Roger's wife came home from work, and when she got to the apartment, Roger wasn't in there. She tried calling his cell phone, but he didn't pick up. And so she walked around the apartment hoping there would be some indication of where he might have gone, like a letter or something, but there was nothing. And so Roger's wife was really concerned about this because this was totally out of character for her husband to go out at night on his own. And so she, operating on a gut instinct, called the police and reported him missing. And so a few minutes later, 2 police officers show up at this apartment building. They go up to Roger's apartment, they speak to Roger's wife, and then they go into the hall and they knock on some doors of other neighbors in the area. And after speaking with them, one of the neighbors who had seen Roger earlier said, hey, he lost his phone, and the last I spoke to him, he was going to go down to the trash room to try to see if he could find his phone down there. And so the officers go down to the first floor, they go to the trash room, and they try the door, and it's unlocked. And when they open up the door and they look inside, right in the middle of this totally nondescript windowless room that basically looked like a basement, was this huge green dumpster. And above the green dumpster, high up on the ceiling, was this round opening. And that was the bottom of the trash chute. So when people like Roger and the other people who lived in this apartment building dropped their trash down their respective trash chute on each floor, the trash would come tumbling down and literally fall out of the ceiling into the dumpster. Now, this dumpster was unique. It was not like other dumpsters where the top was just wide open and anyone could lob a bag of trash in. No, this dumpster, only the left side of the dumpster had an opening for trash. The rest of the dumpster was completely welded shut. There was no way into it. And so on the left side, where this dumpster opened up to allow trash to come in, it was positioned right underneath that opening in the ceiling where the trash came tumbling down. And it wasn't just an opening. It was like this near vertical tunnel that was welded on to the top of this dumpster. And it went straight up and it had this big open mouth at the top, almost like a funnel. And it was there to catch the trash as it fell down, and it would go down this tunnel down into the dumpster. And so the gap between the ceiling and the top of this near vertical tunnel, this chute, was maybe 3 or 4 feet. And so when these officers looked into this room and they saw this dumpster and the chute and this hole in the ceiling, they also saw a ladder had been propped up on the left side of the dumpster right up against that near vertical tunnel, as if someone was trying to look down into the dumpster itself. And so one of the officers walked over, they climbed up the ladder, and when they looked down into this tunnel, down into the dumpster, they found Roger. After a lengthy investigation, this is what is believed to have happened to him. After Roger got that key from the manager, he went to the trash room, he opened it up, and then he went inside and found this huge dumpster. And he would have quickly realized the only way to look into the dumpster, and so to go looking for his phone, was to look down into this tunnel. There was a ladder nearby, so he grabbed it and he propped it up against the side of the dumpster, and he climbed up on top and he looked down into the tunnel, down into the dumpster, and as he was looking, either some trash from the ceiling fell down and struck him, causing him to lose his balance, or he just slipped somehow. But either way, he lost his balance and he tumbled into the tunnel, down into the dumpster. And what Roger didn't know is as soon as that happened, he was doomed. Because this was not some ordinary dumpster. This was a trash compactor. And as soon as Roger fell down that tunnel, his body triggered an electronic sensor that activated the trash compactor. And so the way this worked is there was this big metal ram inside the dumpster. There's a ram on one side, and once it gets activated, it will press. There's a hydraulic press that pushes it all the way to the other side. So any of the trash in this dumpster will get compressed against the other side of the dumpster. And then at that point, the ram comes all the way back. And so every time trash would come down that chute, it would trigger that sensor, the trash compactor would start, it would flatten the trash, and so on and so forth. And so Roger has fallen down into the dumpster, he's triggered this compactor, but he's legally blind, he's probably dazed from the fall, and so by the time he realizes what's going on and he's kind of looking around, there is a hydraulic press bearing down on him. And so he probably tried to jump up the tunnel to try to escape the dumpster, but there was no ladder inside this tunnel and it was nearly vertical, so there was no way to climb up and out of it. And inside of the dumpster itself, there was no emergency shutoff switch and there was no emergency exit. And so at some point, it's assumed that Roger realized he was not going to be able to climb up the tunnel. And so he only had one direction he could go, which was to retreat to the far side of the dumpster, as far away from the press as he possibly could be. But once he got over there, there was nowhere for him to go. And so he was forced to just wait as this hydraulic press slowly moved across until it finally reached him and crushed him. Now, we don't know if that very first hydraulic press actually killed Roger. All we know is Roger was trapped inside of this dumpster for several hours, and over that period of time, more and more trash was dropped down the chute, activating the press over and over and over again. And so by the time the police actually looked down into the dumpster, they saw a part of Roger's body, and immediately they could tell there was nothing they could do. Roger was definitely deceased. Roger's wife would sue the manager of the apartment building as well as the company that owned the apartment building for their negligence, but the outcomes of that case have not been made public. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comment section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button has a big public speech they have to give, offer them a mint right beforehand. Except this mint is actually a plaque disclosing tablet. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and mugs and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our merchandise, check out our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.